Hi, and welcome back to our study group discussing a history of philosophy without any gaps by Peter Aronson, busy with his classical philosophy in India, or philosophy in classical India subseries with Janardhan Ganari, yeah, something like that, discussing episodes 19 and 20 today with Rogério Marques and Grandpa, I guess.
Nice to be back.
Always good.
So today we will look at skepticism in classical India and also introduce the school of Mimamsa, one of the schools that takes Vedas really seriously. Okay, so sharing the visual aids. So here we have the visual representation of a person from the Brahmins who were concerned with the Vedas and also the rituals described by the Vedas. And to the right, a photograph of a Vedic ritual in which people sacrifice animals or plants to the fire, and hoping to propitiate the gods to give them what they want. And so let's see what all this means in terms of philosophy. So
Can we just maybe back up just before jumping into Mimamsa? Like the last episode we did last week, just did a summary of 6 Orthodox schools and 2 heterodox schools, actually 3 heterodox schools, I think, was mentioned. And yeah, so I've been trying to figure out ways to make the memorization a little easier. And the 6 schools kind of group up into 3 pairs. And I think remembering them in 3 pairs is a little easy. So you have them in order of 3 pairs there, like you have them grouped already. So Nyaya and Vaisheshika kind of paired up, where Nyaya focuses more on logic and epistemology, I guess, and Vaisheshika more some of the metaphysics. And then Mimamsa and Vedanta are another pair that both take the Vedas very seriously, where Mimamsa focuses more on the epistemology and Vedanta more on the notion of Brahman and the unity of everything with Brahman. And then Samkhya and Yoga are also tightly linked, with Samkhya looking more at the metaphysics and Yoga focus more on practice and ethics. But yeah, so like those kind of 3 groups in my head, almost there's the Vedas group, which would be Mimamsa and Vedanta, and then there's the kind of closer to the Vedas, so the orthodox version of Buddhism almost, which would be the Samkhya and Yoga group, and then there's the more just want to say scientific kind of view, or like scientific kind of approach, which would be the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika schools,
or materialistic or natural philosophy kind of view.
Yeah.
So
maybe another way to group them would be to like the Mimamsa and Vedanta kind of the theological version of Vedas, and then Samkhya and Yoga more like a spiritual interpretation of the Vedas, and then Nyaya and Vaisheshika more a naturalistic interpretation of the Vedas. Actually, the 6 of them together are grouped as orthodox because they all kind of tip their hats at least to the Vedas, with the Mimamsa and Vedanta doing so the most, and maybe Nyaya and Vaisheshika the least, and Samkhya and Yoga somewhere in between. And then the Buddhists and the Jains and the Charvakas?
Charvakas, yeah.
Yeah, kind of rejecting or not sufficiently nodding to the Vedas to make it into the Orthodox school.
Yeah. They kind of dismiss the Vedas quite a bit.
No, your breakdown makes a lot of sense there. What I'm also picking up in that is where it's what they take as basically the primary source of where they're building from, their foundation. And it's like with the Mimamsa and the Vedanta, they're taking the Vedas as the primary. And with the Yoga and the Samkhya, they're basically taking the internal personal revelation. That's all about the individual and the relationship of the external world. And the Nyaya and the Vaisheshika and I'm sure I'm mangling those horribly.
Oh, you're
Is-
good. You're good. Go ahead.
And those are basically external. Those are like the external rules of the universe. So it's like, is it the external objective rules? Is this what's written down in the Vedas, or is it your own personal, revelation? And this is the starting point. And all three of them are legitimate. And it seems like all three of them are just choosing a different one as first, and then bringing the other two in later, tagging on that.
Yeah. It's like, is God the word? Is stuff the word? Or is self the word? And so they have different emphasis or different focus, although they all start from these primary texts from the Hindu tradition. Okay, so we will be looking at how these texts start more broadly, as Adamson and Ganeri introduced. So Mimamsa Sutra starts, now then, an inquiry into Dharma. I will not read the other words in Sanskrit because I will probably butcher them. Then the Brahma Sutra, also known as the Vedanta Sutra, so you can know that there's the pairing there with the Mimamsa. Now then, an inquiry into Brahman. And then the Yoga Sutra, now an exposition of yoga. And then the Vaiseshika Sutra, now therefore we shall explain Dharma. Or the Brahaspati Sutra from the Charvakas. This one is from one of the considered heterodox schools. Now then, we will explain reality. So quite ambitious. And so two words here, Jijnasa, which means inquiry or desire to know, and Maya, this doctrine of unreality of matter, also known as in the West as idealism, this idea of there is nothingness, a critique of vanity and the illusion of matter. And so Adamson kind of highlighted here how the texts are very clear what they're attempting to explain just by the first sentence, and also took the advantage to kind of reproach how often students do their essays, and they take quite some time to go to the point of the essay in the first sentences or maybe paragraphs. Yeah. And so, do you guys want to comment any of this?
Yeah, I'd like to say I'm on board with Peter Amson's sort of expression of appreciation for cutting straight to the chase. It's always like it when people get to the point and then they take a long winding route to get to the point. It's a little annoying to have to get on a ride to somewhere you don't know if it's going to get anywhere interesting. So just people say, now I will talk about the following, and then they talk about exactly what they just said. Yeah, I like that.
There's also this idea that if you don't agree that it's possible to explain reality, then since the Brahaspati Sutra starts with that sentence, you can save your time a lot by just reading the first sentence and just putting down the book. At least that's what Adamson said. So it's quite an important thing to be really clear into what we are going to discuss. So as for skepticism in ancient India, there are a few excerpts here. So early commentators openly raise worries about the very possibility of inquiry. Sabara, who was a commenter of Mimamsa Sutra, said, it must either be commonly known what Dharma is, or else not commonly known. If it is commonly known, then there will be no inquiry. If, however, it is not commonly known, then all the more so. So this work of inquiry to duty is quite pointless. It almost seems like he is mirroring the theme of the Platonic dialogue, where we have these two brothers who make a similar argument. The name of the dialogue is escaping me. But yeah, it's there's this idea of all or nothing, and there's no in between.
Yeah, I also forgot the name of the dialogue with the two brothers, but I think Socrates makes a similar argument in the Meno dialogue. That's where Plato has Socrates elaborating or explaining the theory of recollection to get across it, so that everybody already knows everything when they're born. They just forget it, I guess, either before or born, and so what they're really doing is remembering stuff they already knew when they're learning.
Yeah, the theory of recollection.
Not a very convincing solution to the problems. Much more straightforward, just to say, like, where you can have some inkling of something and not full understanding, and then can deepen and improve one's understanding through inquiry. Just like a straightforward response to people who said, either you don't know at all and therefore inquiry is impossible, or you know everything, therefore inquiry is pointless. Like, no, you can be in between, and improvement can be possible and desirable. So sometimes it makes sense to inquire into things.
Yeah, so it's the Euthydemus.
Euthydemus. And the two brothers, are they the half-wit and the nitwit, respectively? Yeah,
the half-wit and the nitwit.
Forget to call them that.
Who use the rhetorical fireworks to dazzle everyone. I think we'll see a bit of this today in some of these excerpts. I think we will have to do a large self-restraint work because some of them are quite outrageous.
I was going to say, it raises the question, which is more, a nit or a half? You know. And I was going to say, I think your issue, Nerdalliun, is that you just haven't remembered enough, because if you'd remembered enough, you'd understand more, and you'd understand the point. So at least I think that's what I think that's what they Plato would say. So tagging on that.
My kind of go-to, drawing from what we currently seem to know from neurophysiology, is to say that people like John Locke and his tabula rasa are wrong, because we start with a brain, and a brain is not a void. It has form and structure. It has a particular connectome, which between humans shares a lot of patterns that are similar. Assuming that we're talking about healthy brains. And then they, due to their structure and their plasticity, they have predispositions to conform their structure through the process of learning and acquiring experience, to reshape the connections to correspond to understanding and learning and acquisition of competency. And so we never actually start from nothing. We start from something. It's just that we need to kind of carve out from this slab of potential, which is our neurological connections that are constantly changing, to carve them into something that is desirable or of value to us and our lives.
I don't know. I've watched an episode of The Kardashians. I think there are minds that are formless and void.
Okay, I won't contest that. I won't go into that rabbit hole. Moving on. So there's also this excerpt from Kumarila Bhatta, who we will know a bit better later. It is possible to know that which is commonly known, but being commonly known, there is no desire to know it. On the other hand, that which is not commonly known, being impossible to know, is all the more not a possible object of a desire to know. So again, highlighting this idea of all or nothing in terms of knowledge acquisition and learning, a kind of a slippery slope that, if we really do believe that learning and acquisition of knowledge and a sound epistemology is possible, we need to figure out ways to shoot these guys down as quickly as possible. to stay motivated to learn, which I believe is kind of one of the main points of us being here. Already 27 episodes in.
This is sort of like the sports analogy of second place is actually first loser tag.
So I'm just having a look. I think this all or nothing thinking is classified as a special, like a subtype of the false dilemma fallacy. So pretending there are only two options and then saying, well, both options work out badly for the person that's being argued against. So,
or false dichotomy.
False dichotomy, yeah.
Yeah. So we can just do like in Phoenix, right, and shout false dichotomy. Go away.
Silence.
Nonsense. Okay, then there's also from Shankara, if we don't know what Brahman is, how can we go in search of it? But if we do, then there is nothing to discover. So again, in this theme of all or nothing, then so they kind of take for granted that there is a way to investigate, to inquire, to achieve knowledge. These schools that are interested in epistemology, here the Nyaya school, they are focused on establishing an epistemology to answer questions related to validating sense perception to produce knowledge. Doubt is not a start of epistemological paralysis. It is a state in which one already has partially grasped an object, so that it can be the target of further questioning. The puzzle of inquiry does not even arise for the Nyaya school. So it's kind of like someone has decided to hunt something and is in the forest, and they see some rustling in the greenery, and so they might be seeing some game, and so they need to investigate further. And this, since they saw some movement, they have something to start with, basically. It's not like they're just going through the forest and nothing is moving. There is something there to investigate further. That's my point, even though it's clearly not definitive. It could be just a wind or something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we'll get to that, but I think so. About one of the arguments made by the Mimamsa school is when the Vedas aren't explicit enough in their description of the rituals, you can fill in the blanks by looking at other rituals that are given in more detail and following the same pattern. And I think it's quite a general way to arrive at questions is by so looking among known phenomena and seeing a pattern and asking whether that pattern continues to other unseen examples, and then going to look for examples where the pattern continues the same way or maybe in a different way. So whatever is found may then cause you to revise the pattern. And yeah, so I don't think Peter Adamson sort of makes that connection with epistemology, the link between filling out blanks in the rituals and just the general point of so partial knowledge can result from seeing patterns in known cases and then wondering whether those patterns extend to unseen cases. So you can have a pattern in mind to look for without knowing whether it holds or not, whether some other pattern knows. And so looking for the unseen cases, whether they match the pattern or not, can be useful. And if formalized, it sort of can turn with some other tools added to it into something like a scientific method where people make observations and then postulate models to explain the observations, and those models may make predictions for further observations that haven't been made yet. And so those observations can then be made to see if the models check out, and often the models don't check out, and so they need to be updated. And then when you have a better model, that model will still then suggest new observations that haven't been made yet, and that can continue, and the models can be successively improved. And that that kind of process is like a very rough and simplified version of what the scientific method is, and it clearly works. Like it clearly allows people to figure things out that previous generations hadn't figured out yet. So to cumulative or progressively build a better understanding, and applying that understanding to sort of engineering technology clearly works, because we're having this conversation with each of us that's sitting in different continents. So I think the skeptics have much to, but by the way of saying, denying that there are some useful ways to inquire into things that are not yet known. Given that, say, in the time that they wrote their skeptical arguments, no one knew how to make it feasible for 3 people in different continents to have a conversation about Indian philosophy.
Also, an interpretation of these kinds of arguments, both from ancient India and from the Euthydemus of Plato. At least it seems to me, isn't this kind of the doctrine, most typical doctrine of people who want to pose as having the last word on things? So they know because they are the authority, and other people who don't know shouldn't even try. They are just ignorant and clueless, and so they don't have any path of in betweens to acquire knowledge. And so maybe this is a kind of doctrine from these some people who are dogmatists, in terms of wanting to preserve the authority on certain subjects like being or theology or religion or ritual on their sides. And so they want to paint a picture in which there is a huge gap between not knowing and knowing, and there's no bridge, nothing to bridge the gap. If this kind of doctrine has this kind of agenda, maybe it helps explain how some people who are represented actually in the Euthydemus by Plato as being malicious actors, basically, show this kind of idea. So wondering what you guys think.
I'll follow up on that in a second. I was going to just comment that I thought that was the point of Alexandria under the Ptolemies, was you could have people from 3 different continents talking about the same subject together. But no, the point that I see here, and this gets to more of what you're saying, is it seems like they were applying a very group version of Descartes' cogito, in the sense of they recognize that if they're wondering whether inquiry is possible, they can't doubt that this inquiry is possible because they're inquiring into it. It's a question of just what the rules of inquiry are. And it's that self-reference that I think they took as their starting point for the concept of inquiry here. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys. And I also wanted to point out, I did appreciate that Adamson got the point of Descartes' cogito 100% right. It's always nice to hear that. So just gonna tag.
Yeah, props to Peter Adamson for knowing a little bit about the history of philosophy. Yeah, I do think skeptical arguments like that can be made in bad faith. I don't know if they're necessarily made in bad faith, and I think they could be made in bad faith in different ways. So maybe sort of insisting on the superiority of what the person making the skeptical arguments supposedly knows is one option, especially this kind of argument, this all or nothing kind of argument. But I think historically, skeptics have meant to deny the authority of sort of received dogmas. And so they would be rebelling against the authority of religious movements or of, say, mainstream philosophical worldviews, and saying, so those people claim to know, but knowledge is impossible, so they're all full of it. And in the case of India, I think some of these skeptical arguments would be used partially to undermine opposing or rival schools of thought, while still holding on to the possibility of the people making the skeptical arguments having some kind of knowledge. So there's so there are a couple of examples that I think Nagarjuna being quite skeptical of many of the claims of the Mimamsa school and of the Vedic tradition in general, but then still having some Buddhist commitments that apparently he does take himself to know or takes to be true understanding of some kind. So yeah, I think a standard reply in the West for radical skepticism is that the position itself is self-defeating, because radical skepticism is a kind of knowledge claim. So to undermine all knowledge claim is also to undermine skepticism at the same time. But that didn't come up in this episode, which is quite interesting. And all of the arguments are kind of self-defeating as well. I think some of the arguments, I guess you'll get around to some more of the arguments for why knowledge claims are impossible. Like the infinite regress argument at several points require some assumed positions. So to say, and that itself threatens the infinite regress. So the whole thing becomes a little a cookie with infinite regresses in all directions. But yeah, I think one of the points that's also quite commonly made in Western philosophy, I don't know how much it is in Indian philosophy, is that most theoretical systems require a set of assumptions as a starting point that are themselves not necessarily justified. They're just assumed for sake of argument, and then the system is sort of evaluated based on what's achieved by making those assumptions. So what you accomplish by making the assumptions is sort of the justification for the assumptions post hoc, but you don't initially justify your assumptions. You just make your assumptions, you assume your axioms, and then you build your system on top of those. And then if you happen to build a thing that works out in practice, then the fact that it works out in practice is the justification for the assumptions. That's kind of how you get past this infinite regress. You enter some circularity, I guess, at some point.
The story of
but
science.
Yeah.
Stuff exists, and then we move on from that.
Yeah, and we can stuff exists, and we can know things about what kind of stuff exists. Let's carry on from there. How about that? Let's not argue against that.
Okay, so then Adamson mentions a touch point with ancient Greece, so Plato's Meno. The question addressed here would be, would one need to have knowledge of something in order to inquire into it? And then Plato portrays Socrates as saying, we all already know everything that is possible for us to know. Having learned all of these things before we were born, we have merely forgotten these things and need to be reminded, hence the theory of recollection. And so, although someone like myself doesn't accept this at face value, I can see it, as I've mentioned previously, with the ideas of the achievements of neurophysiology, that although it's not literally this, we have some structure that has some potentiality that can be, with some adjustments, reformed into something that will produce a metaphysics, like, for instance, knowing how to learn, or knowing how to read, or knowing how to write, etc. And so, yeah.
Something that just occurred to me is, like, this Socrates that Plato has say we all already know everything is supposedly the same Socrates that says I'm the wisest man because I know nothing. So I wonder, like, maybe one of those was ironic. Like, it seems difficult to imagine the same person that everyone knows everything, and the only reason I'm wise is because I know nothing. But those don't seem to go together.
I think Socrates prefers the word humble to ironic, Peg.
Well, according to Michael Sugru, Socrates was assuming this posture of not knowing anything to kind of lay a trap for his interlocutors, to think, okay, so I will just posture myself as being an expert in this field, and I will just kick his butt. And then Socrates shows that it turns out he knows some stuff, even though he continues to claim he knows nothing. So it's kind of like a person that is a black belt, but just is very unassuming and doesn't seem like he trains on a regular basis. It seems like he will be easily smacked down, but not that. It's completely the opposite. Perhaps it's a narrative device for irony, tons of irony sometimes.
Yeah, I think going with the martial arts analogy, I think it's more like a jiu-jitsu black belt, which usually takes a long time to get, like upwards from 10 years. Deceptively putting on a white belt and going to a new gym and saying, "Oh, I know nothing, and can you show me anything?" and then kicking people's ass. Like really quickly will transpire. Like this white belt knows way more than white belts are supposed to know.
Yeah. Shall we move on? Okay.
Yep. All I have to add there would be like the Ralph Macchio effect. So we can move on from the Karate Kid.
Okay. There's only yes karate or no karate, no in between. Otherwise, you squish like a grape, says Master Miyagi. And then back to Mimamsa. So a priori, we must lie somewhere in the middle ground between total ignorance and complete knowledge. Peter Adamson, quoting from him, he says, "Inquiry begins not from a cognitive blank state or from complete mastery, but from a partial understanding or uncertain belief." Then Sabara said, "Inquiry into Dharma arises because we have too many beliefs about it." And so often people are not aware of the beliefs that they hold, and the beliefs might be operating on an unconscious level. Just like when a young boy who has aspirations of getting the number of an interestingly looking girl approaches her and asks casually her details, and she rejects him, and so he becomes quite annoyed and frustrated with that, and he might not know where this frustration is coming from. It's not necessarily just from the rejection, it's also from a certain expectation he had a priori, but is often not very visible because it's operating in the background. Just to give an example, or just to return to the question about what is Dharma, what is a proper morality, what should we do, how should we act, what is a good system of ethics. We might have some beliefs in the background to help us navigate the real world and function as minimally viable human beings in a society. But there might be some bugs in the code, so to speak, that we can attempt to iron out or knock out using philosophy. And so we don't necessarily start from a blank slate. And oh boy, so this moved a bit too much. So the idea is we do not start an investigation from a position of emptiness. We start from a position of conflict. Example, in regards to morality, we all innately start our lives in egocentrism. So whoever experienced parenthood knows about this, knows that infants and toddlers and small children who haven't yet developed the theory of mind, of knowing that other people have their own experiences, their own inner universe, and also they start innately by emphasizing really intensely, sometimes really explicitly, their needs and short temper and lack of tolerance for stuff that isn't going exactly as they desire. And so this might carry over throughout life, to give us figures like Nero or Caligula, or it might be annihilated or subdued to give figures that are way more socially integrated and respectful of others and others' needs. Okay, guys, I'll taking out.
Yeah, I actually quite like Sabara's response that inquiry starts because we have too many beliefs about Dharma. And I've often sort of thought that like a good way to introduce children to quite deep philosophical questions is to raise them with awareness of several different religions. So instead of bringing them up in one religion and keeping everything, trying to keep it as simple as possible, like really exposing them to like 3 or 4 religions that have different ideas about how things should be done. And that'll very, very quickly introduce them to sort of contradictory ideas of what's good and how the universe works and our place in it and all that kind of thing, and make them wonder about who's right and how do we know they're right and that kind of thing. And that can spark philosophical inquiry to a high level. And I think that's more or less what happened here in this Indian tradition. There have sort of a proliferation of religious ideas and worldviews, giving rise to quite subtle philosophical discussions to try to resolve the conflicts between them. Yeah, I do think that's like, especially philosophical inquiry, sort of different ideas about sort of different ideas about the correct answers to life's fundamental questions give rise to some quite deep philosophical questions. And if you're not too scared that you might end up with a wrong opinion about these questions and be tortured eternally for accidentally stumbling on a wrong opinion about these matters, it could be a very fruitful exercise.
No, I was going to sit there and say, although, again, I understand where that fear of being tortured for eternity can be a motivator for some people. Part of what I'm picking up on here is I need to explore more the definitions of like knowledge and belief within the Indian system. Because just like with the Greeks, I'm sure they have subtleties involved there. And to me, it's like a belief isn't an issue as long as you recognize the belief for what it is. It's when you start conflating that belief with knowledge or certainty or things like that that you start running into all sorts of categorical errors and problems, which tells me that I'm probably having some definitional issues with trying to wrestle with what they're trying to say, because that's usually a sign of that. Just sharing that observation and tagging.
2 words come to mind. The concept of sada, which is, as far as I know, used only in the Buddhist tradition, which means belief after understanding. So the Buddhists very much claim to oppose the blind faith or belief just because. So belief after rhetorically manipulating someone to believe something. And they emphasize the importance of belief after wisdom or belief after understanding. And then there's the concept of avidya. And the very word avidya stems from the Vedas. And avidya means lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. And so very much related to these 6 schools that are intimately related to the Vedas. But to give you, Graham, a better answer to your questions, I don't have yet any of these definitions on what they mean in these texts with belief and understanding and knowledge. Would you like to have a stab at it, Nerdalliun?
I'm trying to remember. You do have a glossary with some of those terms not related to belief and knowledge.
So let's see. Probably it's in the earliest episodes.
I remember like maybe one of the first few slides of the first Indian episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, just
So
another point is
the word Veda means knowledge or wisdom. That's why avidya means lack of knowledge or ignorance. But other than that, I haven't found here any words. Go ahead, Nerdalliun.
I was just going to mention that the Sada, like the Pali language, is a little different from Sanskrit.
Yeah. I think the Sanskrit version is Shraddha.
Shraddha with a R in it. Let's see. Do a quick Google search if all else fails. Yeah, Shraddha is translated as faith. Yeah, it doesn't have this connotation with blind faith that the word faith has in English necessarily.
Yeah.
Man, my internet's really slow. Even
it stems
even
from
pages are struggling.
stems from Proto-Indo-Iranian, so a really interesting, probably very ancient word.
I didn't mean to toss us down this rabbit hole. Sorry, guys.
That's an interesting question. It's relevant to the material we're looking at.
Yeah.
I just know that for me, when I'm running into those sorts of processing issues and things aren't going right, it's usually because I'm not using the definitions that the writers were actually using, and I need to try to adjust my understanding. Invoking the math term, trying to find the functor between what they were saying and what I'm thinking. Tag.
We're also a bit limited by what Adamson has tossed our way, especially considering we start from a position of more ignorance in comparison to ancient Greece in this subject in India. And so if they don't explain us some terms, we will have a harder time navigating wiki and other sources on them.
My browser is reckoning, you know what, I'm already running a stream. There's no reason to open other tabs with anything. Like nothing's loading. I'm surprised you guys can still hear me and I can still hear you. So I think I won't bother with.
Let's go forward and see how this goes. And if we still have etymological questions, we go back to them.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so going into musings on self, so knowledge of the self by Shankara from Vedanta. And so he says, its very nature, svabhava, is said to consist in what is eternal, pure and consciousness, bound up with the omniscient and the omnipotent. For the meanings such as being eternal and being pure are derived from semantic analysis of the word Brahman. These meanings following from the verbal root br. And br means to grow. Brahman, and Adamson added, Brahman is maximally great, it is all grown up. And then this linguistic analysis is called Vyutpati or Nirvakana. Well, to go back to the concept of Dharma, it's that which upholds order in the universe, or that which upholds order in the society, or order in a household. And Shankara goes forward with he attempts to demonstrate how investigation of Brahman is at all possible. Everyone knows of the existence of his own self and does not think I am not. If the existence of one's own self were not perfectly well known, any one of us could think I am not. And so he's kind of foreshadowing a bit of what went down in Augustine and Descartes, as Adamson pointed out. Okay, tagging out if you guys want to comment.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this. Looking at the roots of terms and the etymology of the roots of terms seems to be something that's quite popular among sort of religious thinkers and theologians and stuff. I've very rarely met people in daily lives like management scholars or engineers or people who care much for the roots of terms and the etymology of the origins of terms. Like almost every time someone does an etymological analysis of a term, it's been as kind of priest or pastor or a theologian or that kind of thing. So I don't know. It's, I think the practice of trying to achieve insights and understanding and knowledge by looking at the roots of terms and their etymologies and stuff is called philology. But you guys can correct me on that if I'm wrong about that, or if philology means something else. So
I think it's roughly that. And philology was big in the times of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, when people like Max Muller were translating Sanskrit texts like the Upanishads as if there were no tomorrow. So they were receiving huge amounts of really philosophically meaningful and relevant texts to study. And they probably were going crazy about these obscure words that the translators left notes of translation and whatnot to figure out where they came from in these Proto-Indo-Iranian traditions. And so, yeah, probably philology flourished in those times.
Yeah, I was going to say the British, they were much more practical. They didn't have much use for all that philosophical stuff, so they just left that to the Germans, you know, from the fire hose that was the British Raj. So tag on that.
Yeah, that's kind of amusing. The British who were occupying it, they left it to the Germans. So there's a word from Indian philosophy in Sanskrit that I will share here, which is jnana. Jnana means knowledge. And so I think there's at least down the road here in these slides a word that is actually at least a composite of this one, or rather, let's see before, because when we were showing the first slides, yeah, exactly. So here, Athato Brahma Jijnasa. So they are kind of using this this jnana term here as a composite with Brahma. So the understanding of or knowledge of Brahma. And they kind of use the composite knowledge of Brahma as developing understanding of Brahma. So there's the words being used, at least in the introduction to the Brahma Sutra and also the Mimamsa Sutra. In the Mimamsa Sutra, we have Dharma Jijnasa.
So Jijnasa is the desire for knowledge, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Inquiry or desire to know. So maybe in light of what we learned from Paninian grammar, these are there's an emphasis in the sentence of the action of developing knowledge.
Yeah. I guess the other word that gets used for people who do these kinds of things, or this kind of practice that's related to philology but not quite the same thing, is hermeneutics, sort of looking an investigation into the meaning of texts, often the hidden meaning of texts.
Yep, I'm a fan of both, but no surprise there. Tag.
And there's
It's a little
some kind of writing analysis.
It's a little surprising, Graham. Someone trained in economics to be into philology and hermeneutics is a little surprising.
So, going back to these slides, after this one we have also a quote of Chandogya Upanishad, "You are that, tat tvam asi." So the self in its original pure and primordial state is wholly or partially identifiable or identical with the ultimate reality, which is Brahman. And so since our self is connected to this ultimate source of absolute knowledge, probably we only need to work on the connection so that the connection is more properly established or better established, so that we can easily acquire knowledge directly from the source instead of toiling in the mud of empiricism, logic, and etc. And it's more or less consistent with what the character Krishna said in the Bhagavad Gita. If you're constantly doing stuff with me in your mind, always keeping me in your mind, me, the ultimate thing, then you will much more easily achieve success, whatever that might mean, like liberation or moksha or whatnot. So it seems that there's some correlation there between the this concept in the Chandogya Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita.
The question that I have here is, I wish one of them could explain to me just what partially identical means, because it hurts my head to try to figure that out on my own. Tag.
Well, Adamson did not develop that one further.
I'm more with Leibniz with the, his principle of indiscernibles, identity of indiscernibles, and it's like, it's either identical or it's not. There's no partial in there. Yeah. That's why I need to look back at definitions more. So that may resolve my my headache. So tag.
Okay, so I wish you get well soon, get better soon from your headache. Let's see how this this works. Any words, Nerdalliun?
No, I'm still trying to get my browser to load
Okay.
translations of belief into Sanskrit, and it's really annoying that it won't load. I feel like part of my identity is shut down because I can't access the internet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's the technological equivalent of perceiving a lack of connection with Brahman.
So I think I can explain to Graham. See, I am partially identical with Google, because whenever people ask me, what do you think, Francois, I can quickly Google stuff, and then Google can inform me what I think, and then I can inform other people what I think. And if a person always keeps in their mind Google when acting, they'll do a lot less stupid things than if they don't keep Google in their mind. Sorry, being a little facetious, but yeah, I do think identities can partially overlap. I guess it's not a strict use of the word identical. Then it would just be like the English term for that would be similar. So similarity is partial identity. How about that? You're okay with the use of similarity? Or
Oh yeah, no, I'm cool with similarity. That works for me. It's this idea of trying to jumbo shrimp, oxymoron those two together. It's like partially identical is just not something that works as far as, with my word usage of the words. Like I said, it may be perfectly sensible under Indian, because I know the Jains have all sorts of logical distinctions. Tagging on that.
Okay, thanks for taking a stab at that, Nerdalliun. I think it was really interesting. It's kind of like there's isomorphism, which if it's a complete isomorphism, then both things, the metaphysical model and the thing being represented by the metaphysical model, could be said to be identical. While if there is a partial isomorphism, it's like we don't completely represent the thing or the process. Also, I was reminded of the concept from Heinlein's A Stranger in Strange Lands that he used quite a lot, which is the concept to grok. And so when he was explaining a complex concept, and he wanted to state that a person completely understood the system, he would say he groks the system. And so maybe we need to grok the Brahman. Go ahead, Meryl.
Yeah, I wanted to take another stab at partially identical, so overlapping identities. Makes me think of the really interesting book on friendship that I've been busy reading. I haven't read any chapters of it very recently, but I got sort of most of the way through and then started reading other things. But there was a chapter on, I guess, different notions of closeness in relationships. And one of the most common notions of closeness, like when people say they're either close friends or they're really close with their spouse or they're really close with their children, the metaphor used would be overlapping identities. So if you're really close to a friend, people speak in ways that they're partially one with the friend, like they're partially the same person. And there's some neurological evidence to back up that when people describe this metaphorical experience of experiencing their own identity as sort of partially fused with the identity of another person, I sort of doubt how strong the evidence is, but there is some neuroscientific evidence that people use the same parts of the cortex to reason about their friends that they use to reason about themselves, and they use a different part of the cortex to reason about people who they're not that close with, so strangers, or so they think of strangers as entirely separate, and they use a different part of the cortex when engaged in reasoning tasks about complete strangers. And then when they have to reason about close friends or close family members, the areas of the brain that they use to reason overlaps with the areas of the brain that line up when they reason about themselves. So there's some evidence indicating that the experience is rooted in some neurological phenomena, so that they're not just making it up and it's entirely unrooted, but there is actually a similarity in experience of the other and experience of the self. And one can sort of imagine some of that by thinking about the dynamics of personality development between people who are emotionally close enough that they strong enough rapport with each other that they very much empathize with each other. So when one person finds something funny, the other person finds it very difficult not to catch the humor, like sort of not to catch the contagious laughter. Similarly, when they're sad or when they feel other emotions, and that kind of contagion of emotion can be conditioning. So if you have some way to regulate your emotions independently of things that happen, you can actually condition yourself to experience emotion in the presence of some things, and that goes back to behaviorist psychology, where you can have unconditioned responses conditioned to new stimuli. So you can make a dog salivate at things that have nothing to do with food by training them in a certain way. And so I think by experiencing things with other people we're close with, if you're sort of empathizing with each other, you can learn emotional responses that are basically the same. So you begin to, at an emotional level, really have very similar emotional reactions to stimuli. So you respond similarly to movies you watch, or you respond similarly to news events, or to personal dramas, or whatever. And in that sense, you feel like you're kind of the same person. You have the same personality, but it's exceedingly rare for that to be a perfect match. So people will still differ from each other. And so growing closer, there's becoming more similar in personality, at least at this emotional level, and maybe even at beliefs and the kinds of things people say. The people's language use will become more similar. They'll start using the same slang, same turns of phrases and stuff. So they'll start quoting each other, and they'll start using the same prosody, so the same rhythm and the same intonation of voice. So they start talking. They may adapt each other's postures and mannerisms. So they use physical mannerisms that are similar. And so, yeah, I think people's personalities can become more and more similar, and they can experience each other as being closer in the sense that the other person's happiness is my happiness, and the other person's grief is my grief, because of how much they empathize with each other. So yeah, I think in that case, at a personality level, it makes a little bit of sense, at least to me, to talk of overlapping identity. Because people's personalities can overlap in that way, in the sense that they share values and they share mannerisms and they share manners of speaking and ways of life. And yeah, that kind of, like, sort of most of the things we think of as central to personality can grow more similar, or people can grow more distant, so they can go off in different directions. And it makes sense to say, like, those people's identities, their identities overlap more than another two. So you can do comparisons where people's identities overlap more or less, and the overlap will very rarely be perfect, and I think it will very rarely be non-existent, because at some level we're humans, so we share some things that are common amongst most humans. So I think maybe in a very general sense, all humans are partially identical. But then I think most humans have idiosyncrasies that set them apart from other individuals. So I don't think the overlap with humanity is entirely the same. And yeah, different people respond with more or less empathy. So some people are decisively more empathic and more emotionally influenced by the emotions of people around them, and some people are less influenced by the emotions of people around them. So yeah, I think, Graham, you've in the past said that you don't have the experience of sharing in a group identity and getting swept up in group emotions. So I'm assuming you're one of the people who generally less affected by the emotional state of people around you. But from just interacting with you, it doesn't seem like you're completely unaffected by the emotional states of people around you. You do seem to be moved by it at least a little bit. But yeah, there's some people more so, and some people can completely lose themselves if other people have strong emotional reactions. They can completely get swept up in the emotions of others, to a point where, yeah, I think it makes sense for them to say say things like, "Oh, we're one," or whatever. Like, I think if you're being very pedantic and literal, you can say like, "No, technically not perfectly one." But yeah, when people speak poetry, that kind of thing, they don't necessarily mean in very detailed terms that people are one. But yeah, I think that kind of notion of identity overlap and being close with people, can talk about people being partially identical to each other.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and part of what you're saying explains a lot. I wouldn't describe myself as unaffected. I would describe it as differently affected. It's like I'm very in touch with my emotions. It's like just a lot of times what most people's reaction would be is almost the virtual opposite of what mine is. So it's not that I'm not reactive, it's I'm differently wired. And the part that I find so fascinating of what you said is that ability to do that hard-walled severance between two categories, like the close friends versus the strangers. What you're saying is that on one level that the minds that are doing that aren't recognizing that they're embedded within a larger hierarchy, because I'm seeing that one where it's like you were saying, it's a matter of variations. It's like everybody's different, but everybody's the same at the same time. It's one of those paradoxes of life. And what you're saying is that they basically, at some point in time, I'll guess I'll just say neurotypical people do a hard severance between this is a category A, this is a category B, never shall they mix, as opposed to seeing them both embedded in a higher level hierarchy, sort of at the Hegelian synthesis. So I find that whole concept fascinating, and I'll have to look more into the neurochemicals involved and those pathways. So thanks for that, Tag.
You also reminded me of Aristotle, who was asked, "What is a friend?" and he replied, "One soul dwelling in two bodies." And so the neurophysiological equivalent of that would be the parts of the brain that are most at work when their friendship is being expressed are probably similar. They will find the same things funny. They will find the joy in certain things that are similar, etc. The contrast that with you know a person and you think you're close to that person and you find something funny and you are absolutely sure they will find it funny as well, and they have completely an opposite reaction to that. They will even kind of react with disgust or repulsiveness to the thing that you thought funny, and that is the time when you figure that you don't know them as much as you thought you knew them. So just to contrast with what you were explaining, and that gives feedback to show how much or how thoroughly there is actually a soul dwelling in two bodies or not.
Yeah, harkening back to an example I gave just before the start, like if I share a piece of music that for me a sort of strong association with grief and sadness and melancholy and heaviness, and a person reacts thinking that it's sexy, and it's just being confused like that. No, there's nothing sexy in this. Okay, I guess we're not similar in that way.
Yeah. Okay, let's proceed. Okay, so if we have immediate knowledge of the self or Brahman, why do we need to inquire into it? So, well, we have connection to the source. What is all this intellectual heavy work and etc. needed at all? And so, because our intimate awareness of Brahman does not include an understanding of its true nature. So it's kind of like we are so close to our mind that we cannot see our minds from a remove, and it makes everything really difficult to disentangle. It's really difficult to do science of one's own mind, or impossible even, because of so much subjectivity involved. And maybe that is what's at play here. Then go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I keep having to remind myself that these are people that very much take the idea seriously that you can understand the fundamental principles that govern the whole cosmos by understanding the self. And I was just kind of thinking through that. I mean, it's not obviously wrong, but I kind of don't buy into it. It's not obviously right to me either.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in some sense, we're in this, like, if you want to think of reality as a container, like all of reality contained in something, we're part of reality, and maybe the principles that govern the whole container are the same principles that govern us. That's sort of saying we're natural beings inside, like, a part of nature, and but it's I don't think that, like, by doing sufficient introspection, anyone would ever come up with say, like, laws of gravity, and how someone would come up with laws of gravity, or any, like, really fundamental physics. I think there are laws governing nature that also govern us. So, like, in principle, like, yeah, we're, like, also subject to the laws of gravity. But, like, doing enough yoga or doing enough mindfulness meditation, I don't think will ever allow you to write down the equations of gravity. Well, certainly not write down the equations, but I think there may be more things sort of governing nature, and, like, interesting things to find out about stuff that exists that they'll be very difficult to, or for practical purposes, impossible to discover by doing sort of introspection. And this is a tradition where the notion that, like, introspection will get you everything, like, you can discover all there is to know about reality by understanding the self, is something that's foreign to me.
Look at this example. Although most people will say they are not math people, and they probably have a point in that they don't know complex calculus, and they are not even aspiring to know it, or they even are repulsed by the idea of even trying to know it. But throw them a ball, and their brain will intuitively do calculus to calculate intuitively where the ball will perform its trajectory, and they will, if they are good at catching a ball, that is, they will shift their hands to a place where the ball actually will fall, based on some predictive model that their brain has or does, without conscious awareness. And so, to me, that's an example that I've kind of developed, that although you might not know consciously these things, there seems that there is a part of you that seems to execute the knowledge of these things, or at least some of them. It might be a too ambition of a thing to say everything can be known by looking at the self. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. It's the same example that's used by Gerd Gigerenzer as one of the big names in naturalistic decision making, also a German tradition of judgment and decision making. They talk about an outfielder in baseball running to catch a ball, and you can describe the problem, like the trajectory of the ball and the trajectory of the outfielder running, in order to meet the ball at its landing place, in order to catch the ball, as a system of differential equations. And it happens to be a system of differential equations that's really difficult to solve analytically. And so people have argued, like, yeah, the outfielder may be completely useless at calculus, but somehow they're calculating the solution to this very complex system of differential equations. And it turns out that there are shortcut heuristic algorithms that perform very well in terms of finding the correct answer, that don't solve the full system of differential equations. So there's one heuristic where if the outfielder just holds one of the angles with the ball constant, so run at a speed such that a specific angle is maintained more or less constant, they will end up at the right place. And it's a much more feasible kind of problem to solve. So you can sometimes brains can solve much simpler mathematical problems that give you the same solution. and much quicker, and it takes less energy to compute the answer. Whereas if you had to describe the problem in full and solve it with a full analytical method, it may be much more difficult. You may not get a much better answer. It would take more compute. And in general, like computer systems can solve the same problem with a vast array of strategies. And some of them are really solving quite different problems and using the solutions to simpler problems as approximate solution to the problem at hand. So it's not necessarily the case that that the brain is solving the differential equations. It may take some other strategy and end up getting a solution to a problem that can be formulated as a system of differential equations, but need not necessarily be formulated as that problem. But yeah, I kind of get your point where people can have intuitive knowledge of things where if they inspect themselves and they articulate that intuition, they would arrive at something like scientific models. And often in the history of science, that's where the initial theories came from. People sort of had intuitive ideas about how things work, and then they were trained in philosophy and mathematics, so they were able to articulate their intuitions, write them down in a way that can then lead to predictions or be reasoned with and built upon. And oftentimes that like successive progression of that would lead to models that are very counterintuitive, so that have elements that if you tell people about them and people inspect their intuitions, they think like, no, that's definitely wrong. But then you test it out in the field, in the world, and it works better than the things that are intuitive. Yeah. I mean, like introspection is clearly important. I don't want to put down introspection. I think it's necessary. Like there are some kinds of self-knowledge that are not possible if you eschew any kind of introspection. But yeah, I kind of think experimenting in the world and trying things out also necessary. And if you, I don't know how many of the Brahmins or their dissidents would really advocate for a life that's completely devoid of practical action and practically trying things out. Just sort of sitting and just turning inwards. I think those were maybe a relative minority of people. Actually, I think the position that you could come to all knowledge that's worth having, or that you might want to have just by introspection, seems a bit extreme. I don't know that was the majority view, but it seems like it's there in the Vedas.
Maybe several times repeated.
Yeah, but like then there are the schools where they think all the knowledge you need to know are in the Vedas. So what you need to do is you need to study the Vedas, which is not introspection. The Vedas themselves, places says like all you need is self-knowledge, which presumably you'd get by introspection, not by looking at the Vedas. So probably like the history of that philosophical tradition followed something like there were teachers who spoke with each other and who sang poems, and they understood some things about human nature by introspecting and probably also by observing the people around them. And then they put their insights, limited and faulty as they are, but also partially correct, into Vedas, and then those Vedas became new sources of indoxa for a next generation of people to comment on and elaborate, and to criticize and to challenge and to elaborate in all kinds of different forms. Sorry, I'm ranting a lot today. I should probably stick to the material.
You're giving us indoxa. Graham, anything?
Yeah, no. I was gonna say it brings up. Not everybody has those intuitive senses of balls and where they land and stuff. I know that because learning to play baseball is one of the hardest things I ever did. Funk doors between categories, child's play between learning how to actually hit a curveball. I recognize that in India that would be cricket that they would have to have trouble with, but
yeah.
No, One aspect of it that they seem to be conflating is the experience of the self is the same as knowledge of the self. And I think that that's a categorical mistake, because the experience of the self is where the knowledge comes from, but that knowledge is contained within that experience and isn't identical with it. It requires further processing of the experience to extract the knowledge. And it seems like when you start conflating the two, you're losing a lot of the process of actually learning and everything. That makes sense to you guys? Tag.
Yeah, I would also like to add, Graham, that often when we are experiencing ourselves, and we might do that through many different means. We might experience our reaction to a piece of poetry or music or any other artistic production, or we might actually meditate with any of the many types of meditation techniques, or we might experience something outside of our comfort zone. To see how our psyche reacts to something that we have not experienced before. And so there are many different tools that have been identified either recently in our modern days, or throughout antiquity, means of experiencing oneself. But these experiences will tend to be mostly non-verbal. We often have, when we experience something related to what we could describe as the sublime, when we are meditating or doing acids, which I don't recommend, by the way, or any other supposedly tool of mysticism meaning trying to experience the self more intensely or more thoroughly, or etc. It will often be difficult to translate these non-verbal things, like when we dream, into propositions, into actual statements, sentences and texts that make sense and can be used and can help our lives. But maybe it's because of the strangeness of it all. It's like we are traveling through some alien world where things function quite differently than our own world that we are habituated to. And so maybe the people that wrote the Vedas were veteran mystics that maybe meditated, practiced yoga, and were really self-disciplined, practiced a kind of austere life. And they were constantly testing their own self, their own boundaries, constantly keeping themselves out of their comfort zone, gaining little by little knowledge of how the human mind, how the human psyche operates, and if there is something essential to human minds, which in a collective they might arrive at little by little. And then so this kind of tradition probably is something, in my attempt to describe a semblance of a tradition that might have produced and then further developed the Vedas, and also, to say the Vedas, the further Upanishads and even the epic poems and whatnot. So maybe it's not enough for us to say that self-knowledge it has potential, but probably it's not going to be the be-all end-all source of knowledge. But still, if we are to do some mystical practice, it's better to know what we are doing and how to use these tools, because probably if we don't know how to use tools of self-discovery and self-development, probably we will make little or no progress, or even maybe do harm, basically. So it's I think worthwhile to put some cautions here and try to sense limitations in mysticism.
Yeah, I think I can add a little bit to this discussion. I kind of like the distinction between knowledge and experience that Graham suggested. And it reminded me in the week at the cognitive science meetup, we looked at a lecture about the mind-body problem, and one of the things that came up was a philosophical thought experiment, I think called Mary the Color Scientist. Don't know if I'm probably not going to do the whole experiment, like a whole long version of it, but a short version of it is Mary is her whole life neglected of the opportunity to see any colors. So however you want to contrive a situation where you can deprive a person of seeing any colors. So maybe giving her some VR goggles that filter everything black and white. And she becomes a color scientist, and she learns everything there is to know about like the wavelengths of light and about the optics of eyes of all kinds of animals, and like how nervous systems process visual information of all kinds of different animals. And so she becomes a complete expert in color vision, and then after that point, say the VR goggles are either taken off or the color settings are turned on, and she experiences color for the first time. So the question there is, when she experiences color for the first time, does she learn anything in addition to what she knew as a color scientist about colors? And most people's intuition is like, yeah, definitely she's learned something new. And some people might articulate that as she's had an experience of color for the first time, and scientific knowledge of color is very different from an experience of color. And yet people still use the word learning. And so I guess so one kind of conclusion to take from that thought experiment is that there are kinds of learning that aren't scientific learning, that are more experiential. And there are schools of thought in education that really stress that experiential learning is an important part of learning, and you can't get that by studying equations or studying scientific facts from books and stuff. You need to have experiences as well. And neuroscientists have identified different kinds of memory, and so they draw a distinction between semantic memory and episodic memory. And I think episodic memory are the kinds of memories we have of past experiences. And so she can have Mary can have rich scientific memories, semantic memories of the science of color vision, with zero episodic memories. And when she's first exposed to color, she gains episodic memories of color that in the past she didn't have, and that is a kind of learning. And yeah, I think it's similar with, say, the self. There's some experiences that it's possible for minds to have, some altered states of consciousness that it's possible to have, and you might have a scientific understanding of those experiences, and like a scientific understanding of the experience is not the same thing as an episodic memory of the experience, or even just having the experience in real time. But yeah, I do think the scientific understanding is also very valuable, like real scientific understanding, the kind of understanding that allows counterfactual reasoning of causal mechanisms that allow you to accurately predict, if I do the following, what is the likely consequence going to be. We kind of need those accurate kind of predictive models to plan effectively, and it's a very important part of decision making and rational action in general. But it's to understand. And I think when it comes to selves, having a understanding of how, like literally how, like the mechanics, I guess, the dynamics of how selves develop from childhood into adulthood, and the relation that has to say evolutionary precursors. So how species evolve to be able to be capable of developing cells, and like through the lifetime how cells develop, and how specific aspects of cells develop, how attitudes develop, how personalities develop, how belief systems develop, and yeah, how those things can be deliberately influenced and changed in particular ways. I think that kind of understanding will require a person to to look at other people also. I don't think you can get sort of rich causal, and even to look at other animals. So I think you can learn stuff by doing experiments on rats about how minds work and how cells work that you can't get just by meditating. Just like you can, through meditation, have experiences that you'll never have if you only study the psychology of rats. So they're different methods with different limitations and different strengths. And there's no reason you shouldn't do both. You can look at the psychology of rats and also meditate, have those experiences. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I think there are many ways to learn about the self, and not all of them involve introspection. I think reading stories, reading history, learning about science, and there are various sciences that are relevant: neuroscience, artificial intelligence, psychology, anthropology. Some of them more controversial to core science, some of them less controversial to core science. Yeah, and having conversations with people, like, you can learn a lot about yourself and about people in general in friendships or in philosophical study groups. Yeah, I think a nice spread of different ways to learn about the self is better than becoming all insistent that one or the other method is the correct way to learn about the self. I think they're all just different ways to learn about themselves with different strengths and different limitations. And if you draw on several of them, if not all of them, maybe all of them is too much to do in one lifetime, but if you draw on several of them, you can achieve more understanding of yourself than relying on just one or the other.
This discussion also reminded me of a book that I've read not a long while ago by John Cleese, one of the members of Monty Python, a very creative man. And he read a small book called Creativity, a Short and Cheerful Guide, where he says some things like, put simply, you can't ask your unconscious a question and expect a direct answer, a neat, tidy verbal message. And he, in the book, often describes this interplay between the unconscious mind and the conscious mind by describing the conscious mind as the mind that's more active and more visible during our days, and plays a lot with verbosity, with verbal statements, while the unconscious mind seems to be crunching something continuously, even during sleep. And he even quotes another book called Rabbit Brain, Turtle Mind, that goes into this interplay with the turtle mind being the subconscious mind that has more power, but it's always working on the background. And the difficulty is to extract relevant creative ideas that might be tried by the rabbit brain, the more active, the conscious part of our mind. And he gives the example of people lying down with a problem and waking up with at least an approximation of a solution. I'm reminded of 3 examples in history of people that seemingly pulled some really interesting ideas from their unconscious minds. One of them was Parmenides, who seemingly pulled his poem about being from the the void or the ether or whatnot. Also Ramanujan, who was a brilliant mathematician, self-taught mathematician, who seemingly pulls his intuitive knowing of mathematics out of what he describes as receiving lessons from a goddess Lakshmi, supposedly, according to him. But although I cannot kind of corroborate whether or not this was the case, he was in fact a brilliant mathematician, self-taught mathematician. And then the other one was Kekulé, who was trying to figure out the structure of the benzene molecule, and he had a dream of a snake biting its own tail. And then he figured out, why shouldn't I try to verify if this is in fact the structure of the benzene molecule, ring of carbon atoms, and he was right. This intuitive dream actually helped him, was of use. So there are possibilities that whether we are in a scientific field and we need to fuel our experimental research or theoretical research with creative hypotheses, or we are in fact in a creative field and we need to produce creative ideas, associating other ideas and whatnot, or insights about the world that are relevant. And so there might be value in developing a better connection between the part of our mind that's more well known, the conscious mind, and the unconscious mind that is less known. And maybe the unconscious mind, being unconscious, might be more similar between different people, less subject to modifications perhaps. And so maybe intuitively the Hindu tradition might be trying to point at the unconscious with what they call Brahman. Who knows?
Yeah, that might be.
Okay, so let's go, keep going, and please stop me when you guys want to add some comments. So there were disagreements between what is considered self. So materialists and lay people. So self is the body, like in the other Upanishad where Virokana was completely sold on this idea and left the demon Virokana. Then the Buddhists, self is the flow of your cognitions, as you might remember from the very first verses of the Dhammapada. The Nyaya, self is an agent and subject of experience distinct from the body. So duality, Dvaita Vedanta. Samkhya, self is distinct from the body, but not an agent. So self is more passive. And so Shankara, as you can see, there is plenty of dispute on this topic. So it's philosophical raw material, basically. This needs philosophy here tackling this. And so there's the Rig Veda, the hymn of creation, which goes into self by saying, "Who really knows? Who shall here proclaim it? From where it was born, from where this creation? The gods are on the side of the creation of this world. So then, who does know from where it came to be? This creation, from where it came to be, if it was produced or if not, he who is the overseer of this world in the furthest heaven, he surely knows, or if he does not know." So they kind of allude to the possibility that not even the gods know about the creation. And then there is the Kena Upanishad, another excerpt. So, if you think I know it well, perhaps you do know ever so little the visible appearance of Brahman. There is that part of it you know, and there is that part which is among the gods. And so I think what you must do is to reflect on it, on that unknown part of it. I do not think that I know it well, but I know not that I do not know. Who of us knows that? He does know that, but he knows not that he does not know. And yeah, so these are two excerpts, Rig Veda and an Upanishad, on this concept of knowing or not knowing, being in general, and also the self. And probably there is a relationship that they are assuming a relationship between the self and being overall. So any comments? The next The next excerpt is from the Mahabharata, and it's God Indra speaking.
Yeah, just a little comment on this excerpt. I kind of lose track on who knows what and who doesn't know what in this little.
Yeah, it's kind of a tongue twister, kind of confusing. Well, it seems to be doing an emphasis here on people trying to stay away from hubris and arrogance, practicing intellectual honesty and humility as much as they can, with good measure. So I do not know that I know it well, but I know not that I do not know. So we're always ignorant of the extent of our ignorance, because the the kind of, it's like in a video game, the fog of war that you have. If you have a lot of fog of war to discover, then there is a large portion of the map that is undiscovered. And you, by being a player of the game, and you can see the entirety of the map, you can have an idea of the extent of your ignorance. But since we are not looking at the map of being, we do not even know how big the map is. And so we don't know the vastness of the portion of this map of being that is occupied by undiscovered and revealed fog of war. And so it's, I think, to me, the interpretation is, it's quite certain that we won't ever know the extent of our ignorance.
So I think I follow the first two sentences and then I kind of lose it. So this is a person who says, maybe to bring in some terms from that would make it easier for Graham. Like, this person believes that they don't have knowledge of something, but they don't have certain knowledge that they don't have knowledge of that thing. So they believe they may have knowledge. So I do not think that I know it well. So I believe not that I know it well, but I'm not certain that I do not know it. So, so I do not think that I know it well, but I know not that I do not know. So that part I think I get. And it says, who of us knows that he does know that? So I don't know what that refers to. So I kind of lost the reference for that. So who of us knows that he does know that, but he knows not that he does not know. So so the last four lines, like, who of us
This is in
knows
common.
that?
This part here is in common with the both scenarios.
Yeah.
So even the one that knows that he knows not that he does not know, and also the one that doesn't believe he knows it, he knows not that he does not know. So both of them are in the same footing on that last part.
Here's my take on it. The first guy, the speaker, he's basically saying he knows something about it, but he doesn't know it well. But he also doesn't know that he doesn't know it well. And what he's saying on the next part is anybody who claims that they actually know that, he does know that, but he also doesn't know what he doesn't know about that, because he's chosen to cover over his ignorance with that claim of knowing all of it. The state that he's starting with is the state of a partial knowledge and uncertainty about the rest, as we've been talking about. The other one is that leap of faith, shall we call it, to where I'm going to claim that I know it, and thereby I'm covering over the parts of it that I don't actually know, but I'm claiming that I do. At least that's my take on this tangled ball of dead cord tag.
Let's give a concrete example, so if we see if it will confuse us further or actually help. So let's suppose that that means medicine. So I do not think that I know medicine well, but I know not that I do not know. So even though a doctor has complete dominion of his field in nowadays, according to the cutting edge of medicine, he will still be barred from universal medicine, basically alien medicine and whatnot, extraterrestrial medicine, even more advanced, maybe medicine from the 100th century or something like that. He will never know that. So I think that the second sentence of the two parts is always saying that no matter the extent of your knowledge, there will still be ignorance, whether you know. And so who of us knows medicine? He does not know medicine, in fact, but he knows not medicine, the medicine that he does not know. So even if he really does master the field in his life, there will still be a lot more to learn. Even though he mastered human level knowledge, there will still be knowledge that transcends what is possible to know right now, because it falls beyond what humans have achieved so far. Does this make sense, or is my interpretation flawed in some way?
No, I think it makes sense, and I think I kind of see where I lost the subject. So when reading it, I just kind of felt vaguely confused that I don't know what that refers to. I think in the fourth line, who of us knows that? The word that refers to the same thing as the word it in the first sentence. I think that just helped me close the confusion. I was not sure.
Safe, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if that refers to the not knowing, but then like the last two sentences wouldn't make sense if that referred to the not knowing that the person does not know. It's a brain twister, not a tongue twister.
Yes. Yeah, probably that and it is Brahman or being.
So you can now see why it's so much better resolved when you're simply not remembering enough yet. Tags.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my intuitive.
I think I haven't lived enough infinite lives before being born. That was my problem.
My intuitive go-to explanation was really the fog of war thing, because I think that even if we know 1 or 10 units of knowledge, and 10 units is as far as human technique can go today, we will still be like infinitely surrounded by fog of war, and we might tend to forget that. Kind of like the same way people with a lot of power forget they are mortal, in some sense. So, yeah, that's at least my kind of intuitive exegesis of this. But it's not necessarily right. There are other ways of interpreting, as you've shown.
Yeah, there's also an interesting play with knowing not that someone doesn't know. So in the first instance, when the author says, "I think I know, I do not think that I know Brahman well, but I do not know that I do not know." And where he says, "Someone who does know Brahman well knows Brahman well, but he does not know that he does not know." And so in the second case, it's like in the first sense, it's like I may know more than I think, and in the second case is he definitely knows less than he thinks.
Yeah, I think the gist of this is really don't downplay your ignorance. Okay. Never ever incur in the error of hubris regarding your knowledge. I think it's philosophically healthy to keep in mind that we don't possess godly knowledge. That's also kind of why when interpreting an experience that is complex or a text that is a brain twister, as we've established here, it wouldn't be proper for a person to kind of jump to an interpretation and say, this is the correct interpretation, end of discussion.
Yeah. I do recall, I think this came up in the context, or Peter Anderson brought it up in the context where he just said that skepticism may be older in Indian philosophy than Indian philosophy itself. And so he gave a couple of quotes from Vedic texts that sort of express skepticism. That's much older than the philosophical schools that we'll be discussing from here on out for the next couple of weeks.
Any final words, Graham, before we jump in Indra's monologue?
No, I don't know enough to say more. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Fair
But
enough.
do you know that you do not know enough?
Oh, I know I don't know enough. Okay.
You do know
Okay.
that, but you do not know that you do not know.
Okay, Indra. So now for a slide that completely blinds everyone watching. Sorry for that. From the Mahabharata. So God, Indra, the father of Arjuna, muses on Brahman. And so he says, I used to be a learned skeptic who scorned the Vedas. I was devoted to logic and the science of debate, both of which are pointless. I formulated arguments based on reason and proffered rational statements in assemblies, abusing and denouncing Brahmins over their sacred words. The heretic doubts everything. He is a fool who fancies himself learned. As a result of his karma, Brahmin, he will become a jackal just like me. And so Adamson was quite sure that this is a critique in the Mahabharata, rather a satirical critique targeting the unorthodox schools like the Buddhists and Jains, who just dismissed the Vedas.
Yeah, it seems like a jab at science and a study of rhetoric too, and logic.
Yep.
So.
And that skepticism as well.
Yeah, unbridled skepticism I think is a bad thing, but I do think calling logic and the science of debate pointless is a bit much.
Yeah, this one here goes over the top at trying to regain the control and authority of the Vedas, and shooting down the schools that were criticizing the Vedic doctrines, dogmas even. So yeah, this and after this, we have something completely different. But Graham, please, if you have any words to share, go ahead.
No, just observing that to me, a heretic doubts the orthodoxy. They don't necessarily doubt everything.
Yeah.
And definitely agree that, pretty much anybody who fancies themselves learned, they pretty much inherently branded themselves a fool. And I'm curious what he means by being a jackal just like him. Because is a jackal a good or a bad thing? Because it depends on the culture. Tagging on that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But maybe a jackal is, since it's a solitary animal, he became solitary because he double-crossed his orthodox pals and delved into heretic doctrines. And then he figured out the heretic doctrines weren't a good path for him as well. And so now he is in neither group, and he is a solitary jackal. Maybe that's the reading. So not necessarily the jackal is portrayed as an evil animal here, but
I mean, it is Indra that was transformed into a jackal. What are jackals like in Aesop's fables? They're just cunning, right? They're not necessarily evil or tragic or that. But I guess I'm not sure about this, but I got the sense that among the Indians thought that reincarnation as an animal generally would be worse than reincarnation as a human. So you'd rather be reincarnated as a human, and if you can be reincarnated as a Brahmin human, or better yet, if you can be reincarnated as a god, and maybe best of all, if you don't get reincarnated at all.
Where does being reincarnated as a cow fit in there? Because I think that might be above human in for a lot of human lives.
if in India.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's important to qualify that.
Yeah. I think
Wikipedia gave me a message on jackals in India, basically. So it says in Hinduism, the name of Shiva itself means jackal, and the jackal was often illustrated as the consort of Kali, so another completely different goddess. Jackals are the Vahanas of various Hindu and Buddhist deities. Vahanas, I'm not sure what the word means, but maybe avatars or kind of animal presence of them. Particularly in Tibet, Durga, another goddess, was often linked to the jackal. So yeah, not a bad thing, the jackals in India, apparently.
Hits with one of my intuitions with a tie-in to Anubis, god of death in Egyptian mythology, who was the jackal-headed god. So
yeah,
that definitely fits with it being Shiva as well. Tag.
Yeah. Yeah, Shiva as the goddess of death and destruction as well, and Shiva is the god of death and of destruction more than death, while Yama is more the god of death actually, and the
You're right.
underworld. Let's delve into a guy who will sound very, 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 very interesting. When I was studying this, he kind of it's almost maddening. Well, you'll see. So the Buddhists actually have a depiction of what they call the it's called the Dazu rock carvings depicting 5 of the 6 heretical teachers called Purana Kassapa, Makali Gosala, Sanjaya Belita Putta, and so on. And we will look into the third guy, Sanjaya. And so Sanjaya Belathe Pota, according to the Buddhist Nikaya. If you ask me, is there another world? If I thought so, I would say so. But I don't think so. I don't say it is so, and I don't say otherwise. I don't say it is not, and I don't say not say, and I don't not say it is not. Okay, so he has no position. If you ask, isn't there another world? Both, neither. Is there a fruit and result of good and bad deeds? Isn't there? Both, neither. Does the Tathagata, the name of the Buddha, exist after death? Does he not? Both, neither. I don't not say it is not. Thus, Lord Sanjaya Belatthiputta, on being asked about the fruits of the homeless life, replied by evasion. Just as if on being asked about a mango, he were to describe a breadfruit tree. And I thought, of all these ascetics and Brahmins, Sanjaya Belatthiputta is the most stupid and confused. So I neither applauded nor rejected his words, but got up and left. So you ask a guy who looks like the wisest person around in 500 miles, and you ask him the questions of life, the universe, and everything. And okay, he didn't say 42, but he might as well have said 42 and spared a lot of time to these people.
An open question is why you thought this homeless dude was the wisest guy within that 500 miles. Because it's like, given how he answered, is it any wonder how he ended up as homeless? Yeah, I was gonna the other one in that carving of the 5 heretical teachers. What immediately popped into my mind is, was that paid for by the 6th? Tagging on out of here.
Let me see, because I didn't get the name of the 6th.
I was just thinking, whenever you have 5 out of the 6, identified like
yeah.
that, it's like, yeah, that was probably the one who didn't want to go down in history.
Okay, so let's see. The list here is Purana Kasapa, Makali Kosala, Ajita Kesambala, Pakuda Kakayana, also there. Nigantha Nitaputa. That one's not there. So they left this guy out, or maybe the artwork was partially destroyed or something like that. But this Nigantha guy is not there. And this guy, Nigantha, is by other name called Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. And so one wonders if this artwork is a Jain artwork, basically.
That's popped in my head, or the Jains removed their founder's image. That'd be another possibility tag.
Yeah, well, these are actually, Dazu rock carvings are actually not in India, but to the north, already in China. And so they are from Buddhist origin, and either Mahavira was scratched out, or due to the artwork being defaced or something like that, or they really just didn't even think him worthwhile to include there, or the Buddhists have a secret bro path with the bro pact with the giants, and they are bros, and so they won't slander bros, something like that.
Yeah, that's possible. Actually, like I didn't think the responses seemed confused or stupid. Just like verbose way to say no comment.
Yes. Or I have no position on these matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, but instead he disavowed even disavowal, in the words of Peter Adamson. Yeah.
I cannot recall at this point in time. Tag.
So after this, I have another blindingly bright slide to show you guys that I probably should have inverted the colors. So it is the famous parable of the blind sages and the elephant. So these blind sages, they think of themselves very wise, and so they were given the challenge of figuring out an elephant for them in the dark, basically. And each of them could only experience the elephant in partiality, and different parts of the elephant which are starkly different from one another. So the tusks are very different from the trunk, the legs are very different from all these two, the tail is also different, the side of the body also very different, the ears quite different as well. And so each one of them claims knowledge and says, I figured out this being, this animal. He is like a tree because he feels like a trunk, or he has a kind of like a sword because his tusk looks like a saber or feels like a saber or whatnot, and so on and so forth. And I think this story is Buddhist origin, or maybe even before the Buddhists, but at least it's found in Middle Eastern writings from Rumi, for instance. But it seems to go at least so far as the Buddhist texts. And so it's we will be introducing the three great skeptics, as Peter Adamson exposed. Do you guys want to comment on this story? It's a very famous story. You might have heard about it. Have you heard about it before?
Yeah, I have heard about it before. I can't recall Peterson bringing it up in these 2 episodes. So I'm quite curious why you decided to share that. My favorite response to, like, a lot of people draw from this this parable the conclusion that all religions and all philosophies are trying to describe the same reality, and like the only reason they seem to disagree is like in the blind sages, they're exploring different parts of reality. And so my favorite response to that is, well, like, what if the blind sages weren't all feeding up the same animal? What if some of them were feeding up a giraffe? So maybe 4 of them were feeding up a giraffe and 4 of them were feeding up an elephant. And they did, like, the 4 feeding up the elephant would still disagree with each other, and they'd also disagree with the people feeding up the giraffe. And maybe one of the people feeding up the giraffe would agree with one of the people feeding up the elephant, not knowing that they're actually feeding up different animals. And yeah, so I think we don't know, like, by positing this parable, we're kind of implying that all people are actually, like, doing the same thing. But I do think people are up to different things sometimes entirely. Like, they have goals that send them into such different directions that you might as well say they're exploring different animals altogether. Like, the projects aren't the same. So in some sense, the religious project isn't the same as the project of philosophy. And there are some religions that are quite hostile to some of the goals of philosophy, and there's areas and philosophers who have been quite hostile to some forms of religion, for example. And yeah, like, science is like a third thing. So I think in some sense you could say, like, science is like feeding up a giraffe, while, like, religious people are all feeding up a elephant maybe, and the philosophers are trying to fill up a globe or something. I don't know. I think it's possible that people who are doing the same project may come to disagreements because they have access to different aspects of reality, and they have a different vantage point, and so they may disagree even though they're engaged. They're all doing the same thing, but then sometimes people are doing different things. They're not actually all busy feeding up an elephant. It's a powerful story. I've heard it a lot, and almost every time someone brings it up is in the context where they have a favorite religion, whether it's a Buddhist or a Christian or whatever, and sort of excusing not having to pay attention to other religions or other philosophies because they're all the same anyway. So they can, everything that there is to know, they can learn by studying just their religion or just practicing their religion. And none of the other traditions really bring anything other to the table because it's all just the same elephant. It's just a different perspective on the same thing. And yeah, I don't think you're doing that, Rogério, but like in that context of sort of the denial of the value of diversity, or like a denial of the extent of diversity that exists, I kind of feel a desire to resist that. I see people.
My reading of the story is completely diametrically opposite of that one, because as far as I know, this story ends with, at least in Rumi's version, by him saying, if only the wine sages would start to collaborate together, they would soon figure out the elephant as a whole. They would grok the elephant, to borrow the word from Robert Heinlein. And yeah, there is a possibility that different religions are filling up a different animal. Yeah, it's a possibility. But if religions are earnestly trying with merit to figure out the fundamental essence of the universe, suppose that the universe has only one pillar, and they're trying to figure out the anatomy and how this pillar works. That might equate to this elephant thingy, and different religions are some better, some worse, trying to fill up this arche or prime substance of the universe in their own partial faulty way. And, and it kind of motivates me to look at the different religions and learn from them, even though in partiality they're probably wrong in some respects. But the universe might as well be supported by three pillars, and some religions are feeling the first, others the second, others the third. So even if that is the case, it's worthwhile, because as scientists like Robert Feynman say, we want to figure out the truth, whatever it might be, and we shouldn't kind of presume that the truth is A or B or C or any other possibility. We must investigate it however we can, with whatever tools we can find and employ. And so I think this parable is actually a call for dialogue and collaboration to transcend the faultiness of perspective, of single perspective.
Let me weigh in here. I was going to say the blind sages here do a lot to show the truth of the aphorism, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Now, I've heard lots of stories. I love this one. I've heard lots of stories, many of them including parts of the elephant that aren't normally mentioned in other ones. And it's like, the blind sage that wrote the Kama Sutra was definitely exploring parts of the elephants that aren't mentioned in some popular versions of the story. And it's definitely a good analogy, and definitely a lot of fun can be had with it, tagging on.
Yeah, so if we just think maybe in slightly simplified terms, so I would say like maybe something like an astrophysicist may be interested in understanding the origins of the universe, of like space-time, and maybe something like a cognitive scientist would be interested in understanding and figuring out how the minds work. And in some sense, you could say like, well, both are trying to figure out nature. They're just focusing on different parts of nature. So they could be like two people exploring different parts of the elephant, but fundamentally they're trying to understand how things work. But I wasn't raised in Islamic religion, but I think most of the point of Islamic religion is not to understand how things work, but to surrender to the will of Allah as revealed to the Holy Prophet. And so if you're engaging with the religion, it's more about subjecting yourself to the authority of Allah than it is to understanding anything, whether it is the universe or the self or anything else. So that strikes me as a different project altogether. Like, I was raised in, so I won't say too much about Islam for the risk of saying something that's offensive. It's not the safest religious people to offend, even that maybe a bit much to say. But so in Christianity, the versions I was exposed to as a child, and it's still quite common around me. The project again is not to understand like how the universe works or how the mind works or how anything works. Like the goal is to give your heart to Jesus, to let Jesus inside of your heart. So to make your identity in some way partially overlap more with Jesus, or to allow Jesus to work in your heart in some sense. And yeah, that's maybe a little more similar to the project of Islam than it is to either astrophysics or cognitive science, but seems different. So like maybe you could say like Christians and Muslims are exploring a giraffe, while the astrophysicists and the cognitive scientists are exploring an elephant. Yeah, I don't know. From the the Christians and the Islamic people, I think, like Taoists, again, like that seems quite a different religion. In some sense, like to make yourself in harmony with nature can be seen as sort of similar to submitting yourself to the will of God. Instead, here it's not God necessarily; it's nature. But at least in some interpretations of Islam and some interpretations of Taoism, that can be seen as similar. But yeah, maybe the emphasis in Taoism is less subjugation or like submitting oneself, and more a letting go. I don't know. So maybe you could argue that's quite similar to Islam, or not so similar to Islam, but it seems different than letting Jesus into your heart. So like it's quite different from the Christian project, and quite different also from say the astrophysicist project or the cognitive scientists project. It could go on like with wellness, like say like the project of non-violence again is the Ahimsa project of the Jainas or of vegans, like different projects. And to say, so like if the fundamental goal driving the movement is different, if like they're fundamentally aiming at different ends, I think I don't think it's correct to say like the reason they disagree is because they're exploring a different part of the elephant. If they agree that the fundamental end is to understand how things work, like they're almost already in a realm that's closer to science than it is to religion. I think a lot of religion isn't necessarily, the fundamental goal of religion isn't to understand how things work. It's like in some religions it's stressed as a useful thing to live a better life, so it has instrumental value, but a fundamental value is the service of God, or letting Jesus into your heart, or harmonizing yourself with nature, or something along those lines. It's not understanding, and understanding is only good insofar as it assists that more fundamental objective. And people disagree about what the fundamental objective of their lives are, what the meaning of life is. And yeah, when they disagree about that sort of thing, I don't think it's because they're just exploring a different aspect of reality. Yeah.
Well, I've been reading Rumi quite a lot, and I've been already on the 7th Twitter Space episode on Rumi's mysticism through his poetry. Well, Rumi was born and raised in Islam, and there's not exactly that idea of complete blind submission to God, at least as far as I can see. I might be projecting, of course, but as far as I can see, he emphasizes establishing a friendship, a true friendship with God, with whatever it is that is fundamental with the cosmos. He draws also from Taoism and Buddhism and Platonism quite a lot, sometimes very explicitly mentioning Buddhist character or a Chinese character or a Taoist. He even at one time has a character called a Sufi Buddhist, so he merges traditions and whatnot. But I highly recommend you to check out Rumi's poems. There are three books that I recommend. One is the Masnavi, which is the source text, the big book that he created. Then there is the Divani Shams, which is a book that he wrote in homage of his master Shams, whose name is also means son, as in Plato's son. And then there's also the Essential Rumi, written by Coleman Barks, who is an American Presbyterian guy who found himself entranced by Rumi's writings and translated the poems and adapted them better to English so that they would flow more poetically, more lyrically. And so I highly recommend Rumi's poetry because of the value that it has about talking of aspects of our human nature and aspects of being that are very, very difficult to discuss propositionally, very, very difficult to discuss with words. And so he tries very hard to use visual metaphors to represent different states of being and the meaning of being and whatnot. And Nerdalliun, as you mentioned, different people might have different goals. Like one might have a himsa, while another might have hedonistic purposes. But they, even though they might differ on the surface of their tradition, they are all attempting to solve the problem of being. How should one be? So being is a thing that's on the base level, and there are some attributes attached to being because of us being humans, our mortality, our ephemerality, our fragile bodies, relatively fragile bodies. And in the cosmic perspective, we are relatively short-lived, by quite a lot, if we look at the age of the universe in comparison. And so we are tackling the problem of being, each with our own tools, our own doctrines, our own traditions, and whatnot. So even though they are different, they are addressing the same fundamental thing, being.
Well said. I was just going to say a couple quick points here. One thing that I found is if you're going to say something about Islam, there's somebody out there who's going to take offense at it. So you have to accept that that's just going to happen. And again, a lot of the whole goal of life and things like that is very, culturally dependent. Sumerian culture, it's to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. Again, depends on your culture there. And the last point, getting back to the whole elephant thing, I think when it comes to Adamson, he's definitely on team feel up the giraffe for reasons that I will not speculate about. Tagging here.
Yeah, I think he gave that pretty much away. He really hinted at it during these now 27 episodes that we've been on, covering 2 to 3 episodes of his podcast. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that he's a fan of giraffes. And yeah, I agree with you. If we talk about a certain group of people or a certain subject that people love, there is a really non-zero risk that someone will hate something that we say. That's really unfortunate, but that's how things are. Many people rather take offense at things, as can be seen in places like Twitter, instead of saying, okay, you said something that I was not expecting. I don't agree with that, but let me ask you a few questions so that we can test our axioms. And people do not want, overwhelming, they do not want to test their axioms. They want to pretend their axioms are perfect, which brings a lot of unnecessary, tricky debates. They're not honest debates, they are tricky debates, as Nagarjuna would say. And so we always need to be at all times vigilant and we need to pay attention if people are engaging us in honest debate and they want to learn more and figure out things and approximate the truth, even if just marginally, or they just want to beat us on the head with their axioms, their dogma, their doctrines. And to go back to Islam, there are many people in Islam that are very critical of the extremists of Islam and fundamentalists, and also they are frustrated, and they well, at least people that have frequented our Rumi space, that they recognize Rumi, and he's called also Mevlana in Turkey nowadays, and they engage with us, and the conversation has been really enriching. They've been really spectacular conversation partners, and some of them have vented out this frustration that there are, unfortunately, in so many Muslim countries, there are extremists that bring the entire tradition to shame, unfortunately. And at least I have this idea that not all Islam is this extremist kind of thing that's in the popular conscious of the West, or should we say the West?
Yeah. Now, I'm aware enough of the history of Islam to know there's quite a lot of diversity and quite a lot of richness there as well, and quite a lot to learn from their philosophy, as well, as we'll see when we get to the part of Peter Adamson's podcast that covers the history of Islamic philosophy. And yeah, lots of diversity there, people disagreeing with each other about stuff as well. So it would be silly to pretend they're all the same, and there are different traditions also that have been at odds historically with each other. So yeah, like even within those traditions, individuals are different. So yeah, I was speaking in broad generalizations and mostly speaking from more ignorance than I have knowledge. So I was just kind of trying to make the point that I think different religions are like up to different things sometimes. And while like this parable of the blind sages and the elephant is a powerful way to show how people can be really engaged in the same thing, and there might be opportunities for working together, and if they would work together, they'd all achieve the thing that they're trying to do better than if they would to argue. But then because they have their limited perspective, they get into arguments and they get to fight with each other about who's right, and that kind of tragedy, I think, does happen. But I don't think that's a full explanation of what happens when people follow different religions or do different things in life. I think that's just among the things that can happen with people. They can be up to the same thing, and they can be in a position where if they would rather learn from each other, they'd find out that they're up to the same thing, and they could do better by working together. Sometimes people aren't in that position, though. That's kind of my only point.
If I may, a concrete example. I'm fairly confident that if a single person has a good grasp on psychology and psychotherapy as it is nowadays at its cutting edge, and also gets a good understanding of Sufism, Stoicism, Buddhism, Taoism, just to give a few examples, it's quite likely that they can figure out some novel techniques and interesting ways to further the field of psychotherapy, for instance, a bit like Viktor Frankl did with his personal experience, but also the knowledge that he possessed before his personal experience in Auschwitz and other concentration camps, where he didn't lose meaning or lose hope. He kept developing his meaning for life. And some scholars argue that he drew considerably from Stoicism. And so I think that there is potential value there for different traditions to learn from each other, and for some valuable syncretisms to emerge that can enrich and help the human condition.
Yeah, that seems entirely plausible. We're going through the Dialectical Behavior Therapy Skills Training Manual over in my cognitive science group, and that's an interesting combination of traditions. So Marsha Linehan builds on cognitive therapy, which the early versions of that, the early authors explicitly credited Stoicism with a lot of the techniques they had. But Marsha Linehan also has training in psychoanalytic therapy, and she uses some of those terms and some of those concepts built into them. And as you know, like the psychoanalysts have a little different view of human nature and how that works and how to give therapy than the Stoics did. And she also includes some elements of Zen Buddhism in the thing. So it's kind of this. And also there's some insights from behavior psychology, which are the people who made rats run around in mazes and got dogs to salivate at all kinds of things. It's also a different tradition, and they're kind of all thrown together in a melting pot and actually developed into a system, like a very systematic approach to do something that generally is very difficult, and that's to change adult personalities. It can be done, but it's rare enough so that many psychologists will say it can't be done. Like, it's difficult enough that a significant minority, if not a majority, of psychologists will just straight up say no, adults don't change their personalities unless they get like severe brain damage, and that might alter their personality in significant ways. But like, you won't usually through therapy change people's personalities. Whereas basically the purpose of dialectical behavior therapy is to help people with this with borderline personality disorder heal from that and become less borderline in a sense. And yeah, drawing on several traditions to try to accomplish that. And I think there are more traditions. Like, I'm pretty sure there's some untapped riches in Japanese philosophy. Mind you, Zen Buddhism, I think she did get from Japan, but I think maybe Sikhism was.
There's Kintsugi.
Yeah, and there's probably stuff in China that could have been worked in. There's some Taoism that could have been worked in. Maybe there's we're finding out there's a lot of richness in India that maybe she could have drawn on that she didn't. And there's a lot of richness in sort of Western traditions that haven't been fully tapped either. Like, maybe some inspiration taken, but more could have been taken. I think she could have incorporated more of Aristotle's view. I think there's not a lot of Aristotelianism in there. There's probably a bunch in Islam that she could have incorporated to make it better. But yeah, so as it is, it's an interesting mix mash of stuff. But I think the point you made that a cutting edge psychotherapy can improve by incorporating insights from these traditions is correct, and it has happened. Like, dialectical behavior therapy just is what was cutting edge psychotherapy improved by incorporating Zen Buddhism in a particular way, actually, and mixing a couple of different forms of cutting edge psychotherapy in a specific way, and is now one of the modes of treatment that is cutting edge psychotherapy. So yeah, it's a thing. I think a lot of these traditions warn very strongly about the use of psychoactive substances. There are some traditions that actively incorporate them into ceremonies, still to this day. And there's a lot of cutting edge research in psychotherapy these days looking at the use of things like psilocybin from magic mushrooms or MDMA as part of the therapeutic process that are showing some very promising results.
Mm-hmm.
But the research for that is problematic because control groups are a little difficult to have. So like people who are in the study group get really high and they know they get high, and people in the control groups don't get really high, and it's fairly easy to tell that they don't get really high. So it's difficult.
It's not blind. It's not double blind.
Yeah.
After the first dose, it's pretty clear. Yeah.
So that makes things a little bit more difficult, but there's some theoretical reasons to think that some of the very positive results in treating trauma with something like MDMA should work. Like, there's some understanding of a memory reconsolidation that seems to point like at generally techniques where you can have a powerful, if you can powerfully change a person's emotional state to a positive state while they actively recollect the traumatic thing that happened, they can reassociate or positive emotions with the traumatic memory, or they can at least soften the traumatic emotions that are associated with that. So it makes sense theoretically that MDMA treatment should be very effective for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so far, the experiments that have been done, problematic as they are because of problems with control groups, have been showing remarkably powerful effects. So there's some hope. Sorry, I just kind of felt the need to say that cutting-edge psychotherapy research is doing all kinds of interesting things, not necessarily related to incorporating religions, but also incorporating philosophical and religious traditions into psychotherapy have been quite productive up till now, so probably will continue to be productive.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing and kind of commenting on my my intuition, basically, after reading about the Stoics and Frankl, also Sufism, whatnot, other traditions. It seems to me that since people, when they are engaging in these quote unquote mystical practices of the sama of the Sufis with music, dance, and poetry, and they kind of go into a trance state, even without hashish or other substances, even just sober, they kind of become in a trance or start raving and start saying verses from scratch, improv poetry, or of course the Buddhist modes of meditation, or the ways in which the Stoics contemplate mortality and examine their own selves. These tools for a person to relate to themselves might facilitate self-knowledge in a structured way, which is way better than people winging it from scratch without benefiting from any of these traditions that have perfected or developed these tools for some centuries or millennia. And they might get somewhere that is valuable to them. They might find an aspect of themselves that is very meaningful and figure out that what they are about is X or Y, and thus they might reorient their lives in a way that produces more joy and less suffering, for one. Another is they, by knowing themselves more, they will figure out the quote unquote and crookedness of their mind, just pretty much as Aristotle or the Buddhists would mention. And if we have the crookedness in our minds better identified and described, it's a bit more easier to administer what the Stoics would call therapeia, to little by little, day by day, straighten the crookedness, improve our character in that way. And well, I think this dialogue between traditions, be them religious, philosophical, or even mystical segments of traditions, I think they have a bit of raw material to process by people who are voyaging through them, and then they might repurpose the tools in their own lives, or even in professional practices like psychotherapy. So who knows what kind of things people will discover. Who knows what kind of things we might discover by doing this voyage. So it's worthwhile, I think.
Yeah, that's worthwhile. One thing I would like to say is, like, many of the ancient traditions presented their practices as sort of panacea. So it's one way that's supposed to be universal for everyone. And it's rare for these ancient traditions to give scientific accounts of how and why the practices work. Sometimes they'll give rationalizations, and sometimes those make a bit of sense, but often not. And so just in the context of psychotherapy, I do think that modern experimental testing of things and trying to account for the effects by developing theories and then testing those theories and developing them further really does add something. I think it adds the ability to gather the kinds of knowledge that would allow you to say, well, this specific thing tends to work in these kinds of ways for these kinds of goals. And maybe for some people, not a good idea to do this practice because it may have this and this adverse side effect for people with that kind of problem, or for people with a different kind of problem. I just may do nothing, and from a different tradition, there's something that would do better for this. So beyond just going more eclectic, so drawing from all of the traditions, which I think you can get some of that benefit from if you have a broader set of things to select from, you can kind of maybe use intuition to select practices that are more appropriate for a specific goal set. But if you add like really testing the practices and really developing scientific models of what they accomplish and how they accomplish it, I think adds even more to that, so that you can then make better decisions about how to engage and which practices to engage. And it's not all just about the practices, but like if we specifically think about the practices and in the context of therapy, I think it's important. So I think something like dialectical behavior therapy, one of the reasons I take it more seriously is because there've been an awful number of experiments to try to determine, does it really work? What does it work for? What doesn't it work for? And even in the developmental process of putting those things together was a very empirical, experimental thing. So people would repeatedly try variations of putting those things together in a system and find empirically, oh, this, like putting these things together works, putting those things together doesn't work. And there are many times where there was like intuitively very plausible reasons to think, oh, what we should do is the following. And then experimental tests were shown and the intuitions just didn't pan out, just didn't work out in practice the way people thought it would. So I think, and doing those experiments with a bit of rigor, so like a decent sample sizes and decent control groups and stuff, I think also adds quite a lot to it. So yeah, if it's things that are just adding richness to individual experience. So if someone's saying, well, I can feel my life is enriched by dancing, and I was inspired to do it by reading how the Sufis dance or whatever. I don't think there's a need for scientific justification. I mean, if you can feel your life enriched by practice, then I'm not going to say like, but do you know scientifically that your life is really enriched? And if you don't know, then why even bothering? That doesn't make any sense to do that. But if we're trying to help people who are really in desperate need and like interventions may make things worse, then I think it's just an appropriate level of care to make sure that sort of the more medicinal applications of these practices aren't doing more harm than they do good. Which sometimes therapy, like in just the history of psychotherapy, there have been several interventions that have done way more harm than have done good. Some of the more egregious examples come from neurosurgery. Some of the neurosurgeries, like lobotomies, were just horrific catastrophes of medical science. So it's like not like science is sinless, like scientists have come up with like really bad things. But so from the say the Buddhist angle, I think it's now relatively recognized that mindfulness meditation not the best idea for people who suffer severe trauma. So people who have complex PTSD, not a good idea to be doing mindfulness. There are other things you should rather be doing. Mindfulness could make it worse, that kind of thing. So like for some people, and I don't think it's like the best monks wouldn't take this, but like some naive people may sort of discover Buddhism and feel better about it and think, oh, this is like the thing that's like solves all mental health problems, and all you need is to be mindful of your breath, and that was good enough for the Buddha. It's good enough for anyone. Yeah, for some people it can make things worse in like really bad ways, so you don't want to do that. Or you don't want to just blanket prescribe it as the one solution to everything. And definitely lobotomies, like probably nobody should undergo lobotomy. It's just a horrific idea to begin with. But yeah. So that was a long rant just to say that I do think that beyond just the eclecticism, so you have lots of traditions to select from, a bit of scientific rigor also adds value. And also
which is another tradition.
Yeah.
Science.
And also just a hedge that there's no need to overdo it. Like there's no need to, like if I haven't done an enormous number of experiments to be paralyzed that, oh, I don't know what the scientific result is. Should I mix my blueberries and strawberries 2/3 blueberries or half and half blueberries and strawberries? What does science say? I don't know. Oh, I can't decide what to do, and like that's stupid. But yeah, in some cases, like finding out, all right, if we're going to send people on 3-month meditation retreats, what are the sort of adverse events that happen? Because people do report having all kinds of really bad experiences. They're a minority usually, but depending on how bad it is. Like I think the Goenka retreats are quite notorious for being particularly brutal and people finding them very unpleasant. But yeah, so like asking them what goes wrong is, the people I've seen do that research are people who take themselves as clinicians seriously, and they said if you're doing a clinical intervention, standard operating procedure is to watch for adverse side effects. And so why wouldn't you inquire into adverse side effects? And for some really religious Buddhists, that's almost a no-go. Like, no, it's like the truth. Like you don't. If they have adverse side effects, it's because they're, I don't know, degenerate spiritually. It's bad karma or whatever. But
well, at least the Buddhists that I've been listening to that are apparently teachers of Buddhism, they emphasize the importance of each person figuring out for themselves if the practices actually work or not, and emphasize developing understanding by their own best judgment. So they are, at least the exposition I've had to the intelligentsia of the tradition that are not perhaps the sophists of the tradition, they actually have a seemingly intellectually honest stance and are open to criticism and open to things not being a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So maybe if there are people in Buddhism that express themselves like that, probably they are not representing the tradition very well, because Buddhism, at least it doesn't seem to me to be as dogmatic as, for instance, say the scholastic Dominicans of medieval Europe. But that's also a generalization.
Yeah, I was going to sit there and totally agree that it's really silly trying to sit there and wrestle over what's the proper scientific balance between blueberries and strawberries when, heck, all you got to do is ask ChatGPT and it's decided for you.
Yeah.
You know, I was going to say, a lot of people don't realize even breathing itself can become psychoactive. And you can go in all sorts of, hallucinations and stuff based off of your breathing practices. And I think one of the big issues that psychotherapy is having today is they're trying to say they deal with the mind, and they've severed any connection from any spiritual angle in their work. And they've kind of rolled emotions into the mind when it's really kind of something separate than thoughts. And they're kind of dealing with 2/3 of what they should be dealing with and not doing it well. Just going to tag out on that.
Yeah, I think psychotherapy is a discipline that's progressing. So people are continuously trying to figure out how to do things better. And they wouldn't do that if they didn't recognize that the way they're doing things is problematic in some sense. Otherwise, they could just set up shop and be like, yeah, we figured it out. Let's do it exactly this way forever for the rest of the time. But no. DBT at least gives a nod to a spiritual aspect. They do include, they say they include a spiritual dimension. There are other things. I think acceptance and commitment therapy is also gives fairly strong nods to like a Buddhist spiritual perspective. Buddhism is quite popular, I think, in therapy circles for several reasons, but just generally as a source of material, Buddhism and Zen Buddhism quite popular. Yeah, just about Buddhism. I think historically there have been many Buddhist traditions. It's not one thing, and yeah, I kind of had the types of people in mind who would take quite seriously that Siddhartha was a god, like an infallible, all-knowing god. They may be the ones who object to science questioning Buddhism. I think the Tibetan Dalai Lama basically said if science can show anything that's claimed in Buddhism wrong, then go with science. Don't go with the text. Or if anything in the sutras are disproven by science, then go with science. Don't worry about the ancient texts. So, but yeah, that's a. He speaks for the Tibetan, for one of the Tibetan schools, I guess. Doesn't necessarily speak for Zen Buddhists or for Theravadan Buddhists. Like this, just to name a couple of the big schools. So,
yeah, in broad terms, the Mahayana Buddhists, they wanted to acquire more initiates, and they wanted to get more people, and so they even bent their doctrines to facilitate that, to adapt their doctrines to whatever populations in India or China or even farther they were trying to incorporate, while the Theravada Buddhism tried to keep themselves more true to their roots, in a sense, more true to the earliest texts, and they they didn't care to sacrifice the potential of admitting more people to their group. So that's the gist of it. So maybe you will have the Theravadans kind of reject changing their minds, while the people from the Mahayana schools might have a similar stance to, as you quoted from Dalai Lama, and as I've also heard from Buddha Dasa Bhikkhu, who gives lectures on Buddhist metaphysics, ethics, logic, etc. Well, we have 3 skeptics to introduce here, guys. Should we?
yeah, probably.
I got
probably
one
try to-
last thing to say on the.
Okay. Please.
Sure,
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted this to relate the story on the Dalai Lama and the questioning the Buddha. The story that I heard is that's part of the Buddha's canon and that's the idea. If you see the Buddha in the road, kill him. Is put everything that's said there through your own personal test. And the one that swayed the Dalai Lama was when he looked through the telescope for the first time and saw that the shadows on the moon, because by traditional Buddhist theory and cosmology, the moon produced its own light, so there shouldn't be shadows. And he sat there and said, well, obviously the Buddha was wrong about this. Got to change. Tagging on that. Let's go.
Cool.
Yeah, we should probably try to finish up. I think Graham has church to go to later.
Yeah, sure. So I can present you all in one swoop, and then we comment. So Adamson introduced these 3 skeptics: Nagarjuna, Jayarashi, and Sri Harsha, 2nd, 9th, and 12th century, all CE. And then he didn't describe the pramanas, the sources of knowledge, but I included them anyway. So perception, inference, comparison, and analogy between the other pramanas, postulation, derivation from circumstances, non-perception, negative cognitive proof, or rather the absence of stuff, expecting a jar to be on a table and the jar is not there, so you can claim non-perception of it. And then scriptural testimony, like from the Vedas, or verbal testimony of past or present reliable experts, the so-called endoxa that Aristotle talk about. So yeah, this is breakdown of the 6 sources of knowledge according to the Indian philosophy schools. And so as for the pramanas, the skeptic will ask how any supposed pramana can be trusted if we do not first establish that the pramana is truly reliable. So Nagarjuna would say, if just such objects are established for you by way of a means of knowing, pramana, tell me how you establish those means of knowing themselves. If the means of knowing are established through other means of knowing, then there is an infinite regress. There you have it. You must always have the either be kind of hubristically saying that, well, this pramana is true and just go with it, or you can do an infinite regress and analysis paralysis and be like the donkey between the two haystacks forever. Or you can just say, well, we've done a regress until a reasonable point, and we are assuming this thing is a workable source of knowledge, and we are assuming that we are taking this presumption and we're going with it. And well, Nagarjuna is always telling us that, well, you don't know anything, you know nothing. And then we have the other guy. So he says the system of sources of knowledge is based on correct definitions, and the position of knowables is dependent on the sources of knowledge. In the absence of a correct definition, how can the sources of knowledge be themselves taken as objects of correct expression and practical behavior? If you say that even without a correct definition, we can resort to usage, we reply that we can just as well resort to usage to the effect that the soul has color, the pot experiences pleasure, and so on. So he emphasizes really highly that we must be really, really careful where we land on, where we establish some presuppositions. So the question, can we know that we are knowing? Can we even know what knowledge is? And to answer this, Jayarashi would say, normal people have an ordinary kind of knowledge that makes their lives possible. Even those who know the true state of affairs say, the ways of the world should be followed. As far as worldly practice is concerned, the fool and the learned are similar. And then the third skeptic, Sri Harsha, he is confronted by Udayana, who says, I suggest knowledge can be acquired from counterfactual reasoning. Then he replies, counterfactual inferences themselves stand in need of justification. And so even though the diagram with the 6 pramanas looks all fine and dandy, the skeptics would make a job, would engage in knocking them down and saying that they are not so fail-proof as they seem, all neatly placed in the diagrams of the pramanas. And well, if we don't have any pramana that is foolproof, the only thing that we can do is practice vigilance, like like the Buddha himself said, and probably the skeptics among the Buddhists, like Nagarjuna, would advise as well, because to draw from Feynman, the person that we are most easily fooling, that we can most easily fool, is ourselves. And so, yeah, skepticism all the way, but not to the point that we can't even live. Feel free to say anything before I introduce Jaimini.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you have in the slides Vedanta epistemology. These skeptics, were they in the tradition of Vedanta, or were they skeptics that were just addressed by Vedanta epistemologists?
So, of course, Nagarjuna is from Buddhism, but then we have Jayarashi, who I didn't check, but I can check right now.
While you're checking, so the impression I had was that Adamson was just reporting on the fact that even schools that weren't themselves skeptical had a lot to say about epistemology in response to skeptics from either competing schools or skeptics who thought the whole task of philosophy was hopeless and ridiculous, in order to sort of justify the school and the status of their masters. Schools like Vedanta sort of quoted skeptics and then gave responses to them. So I would have thought that in these slides, that's kind of what's going on. So at least in the section that Adamson discusses skepticism, he sort of lists some of the skeptics that may have been addressed by the Vedanta school. Yeah, so Jayarashi is Charvaka. So it can just be a little.
But it's not clear cut. He seems associated with the Charvaka, these materialists, but his affiliation is still being disputed. He might as well even be an independent thinker. Go ahead.
Yeah. So just my point is, it may be a little confusing to viewers who think these thinkers were within the Vedanta tradition, just based on the Vedanta epistemology slide. So they were not necessarily part of the Vedanta tradition, but they were people who maybe the Vedanta school addressed in their rebuttals of skepticism.
Well, yeah, I think so. But the Vedantans would even foresee skepticism in some circumstances, seemingly replying to skeptics. Even Nagarjuna himself would try to have a dialogue with an imaginary skeptic, and so this might also have been a practice as well. And in fact, these skeptics, by criticizing positions, they are a bit performing a similar function as you've described science doing when science tries to validate whether or not a practice has more benefits or has more harm to offer in for instance, psychotherapy. And so, and this also happened in Hellenistic Greece, where the skeptical school would actually, by being kind of obnoxious, at least in a surface point of view, to the other schools, the Platonists, the Stoics, the Cynics, the Epicureans. They would actually help these schools to become even better, to refine themselves, to abandon positions that are untenable, and strengthen their positions and how they explain their positions. And there's even the possibility that we would not even know about some of these philosophies and philosophical schools, be it from India or ancient Greece, if they hadn't improved with the refining effects, kind of like sharpening stones by the skeptics. So even though one might kind of react to skeptics as, well, these are like the literary critics that people don't want to hear from when they write a book, and they feel bad about getting a bad critic or something like that. But they actually, if you look at them from another point of view, they're actually potentially giving you a message that will help you improve, even if they might be expressing themselves in an undesirable or obnoxious way, or even being courteous. So even, and many skeptics don't even hold positions. They only hold a kind of non-doctrinal positions, anti-doctrinal positions. They just go about criticizing others. I hope that gives a bit of perspective.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Any other comments? So let's go forward with the.
I was gonna say, let's go forward. The only thing I would have to add is that's how both sides of a skeptical argument keep their jobs. Tagging.
Yeah. So Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutra. So he was responding to critiques to the Vedas. So there's this concept of Shruti, what is heard in reference and reverence to the authoritativeness of the Vedas. Vedic adherents considered the Vedas a source of knowledge about the duties laid upon humanity, so a source of ethical precepts. Nyaya Sutra, critique of Vedic ritual. The Vedas cannot command assent because they suffer from the following epistemological defects: falsity, inconsistency in repetition. Also, well, before going forward, I would like to ask, if one of you guys need to go, we can also continue this next time, because this is introducing the Mimamsa, and so it's up to you, Graham. If you're short on time, just let me know.
No, I think starting next week I noticed that the next I had prepared for all 3 episodes, and I noticed that the Mimamsa carries over next one, and I swear I'm going to slip at some point, so I'll just say it now. I'll say mimosa at some point. So we can start with that one next week. That works well for me.
Okay. Yeah, I think we are already 3 hours in, and we'll continue Mimamsa next week. If you agree, Nerdalliun.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Do you maybe want to run us through your slides that you prepared real quick, and we'll pick back up on it next time?
Sure.
Because we do have, like, in the title and the description, we'll be talking about Mimamsa. We give them at least 10 minutes at the end.
Yeah, sure. So
yeah, we'll give them the cliffhanger. Yep.
So Nyaya Sutra critique of Vedic ritual. There's 3 critiques in general. The promises of ritual sacrifice are not always fulfilled. So sometimes you sacrifice and you get what you want, but most of the times you don't. Like wealth or sons or whatever. The Vedas are inconsistent. Sometimes they say do way, sometimes they say do be. Like this idea of the sunrise, sacrifices after sunrise. The Vedas are repetitive. Some of the critics like the rambling of a drunkard, and well, there's arguments for repetitiveness. It might be a pedagogical tool. So also another critique that was added by the Buddhists: the Vedas incite unnecessary violence against beings like the animals that are sacrificed. Actually, probably the Jainas would assent to this critique as well. Rituals are often described in insufficient detail, and so did they mean to light the fire in a square-shaped thingy or triangular shaped? How should I place the bricks and make the fire pit or whatnot? So it's they kind of have the text written lyrically and not technically. They didn't actually give people technical diagrams of the place to do the sacrifices and a detailed description of the steps to really get the gods propitiated, which was the point. Then as defenses, so yeah, the sacrifice is only this idea of inconsistency after sunrise, going to the dogs, doing sacrifices, is only if you intend to do it before the sunrise and actually do it after the sunrise. So and the seemingly inconsistent rules simply apply to different situations. So it's just their adaptation to different situations, and the repetition is sometimes useful to memorize. The defenses. So the Mimamsa school would say that their ambitions were rather to systematize Vedic injunctions, to understand how to proceed, and to expound and interpret, especially bridging the gaps left in terms of the instructions. And their methods would include transfer of details, adaptation and annulment also of details, and prakriti, the model to be used. Like if there is a ritual that's exemplified in example A, it might carry over to example B, and they would inform of this. Annulment of details, I didn't understand exactly what it means, but maybe it might mean that something that people think that it's worthy of emphasis, they will just say that it's not worthy of emphasis, and other things are much more important. And then there's this concept of rice in the pan reasoning, which is, to give the example, you're cooking a pan of rice. After a while, you wonder if the rice is cooked. You taste a single grain, the grain is cooked, and so you extrapolate that the entirety of the pan of rice has cooked rice. And this is a critique to the Mimamsa way of conducting this expounding of the Vedas, because just because the Vedas describe a specific, in a specific situation, a ritual, doesn't mean that this ritual will necessarily carry over to other similar situations. So, for example, a situation demands an ethical reasoning, even though you know the right thing to do in one situation, because despite its specificity and complexity, it's similar to other situations where we knew what to do. Dharma depends upon the Veda, so whatever is not Veda is not to be trusted. They would say in the Mimamsa Sutra. And then Jaimini would say, so most of our knowledge comes directly or indirectly from sense experience, but our senses tell us nothing about morality and ritual. The Veda is the only source of this knowledge. So Vedic exegesis is an inquiry into Dharma. By its very nature, Dharma applies in all places and times. To remind you, Dharma is the upholding of order. So probably written somewhere 4th to 2nd century BCE, the Mimamsa Sutra, possibly composed by multiple authors in several stages, and mentions the Badarayana, the author of the Vedanta Sutra, so the twin school of the Mimamsa. And often in the Mimamsa Sutra, there is a dialogical structure between a character called Purva Pakshin, who he has not made his mind, and he weighs explicitly different perspectives, different pros and cons. And there's a Siddhantin who is decisive and gives a considered position, which is in the end considered the position of the Mimamsa school. And so Jaimini Sutra is a foundational text of prior or Purva Mimamsa, whereas the Vedanta, pioneered by Badarayana, can also be called posterior or Uttara Mimamsa. And now you might be wondering, what the heck does this word Mimamsa mean? Inquiry into doubtful or difficult aspects of the Vedic tradition is the meaning of the word. And that's what I had about the Mimamsa school to show you guys. And if there is time, add any comments, and after we can end.
Yeah, I think that last slide sort of shines light on the first slide, starting with maybe from different schools critiques of the Vedic tradition. So in the Mimamsa, there's a goal to inquire into those parts of the Vedic traditions that have been criticized, maybe forcefully or powerfully, by other traditions, and try to defend Vedic authority against some quite reasonable objections to it. So I think for one takeaway, that would be a pretty good takeaway. I think there are some things in the chapter that Adamson went through that sort of begin to summarize, or just general observations of the kinds of defense that Mimamsa, or that Jaimini gives in his Mimamsa Sutra for the Vedic authorities. So like at a strategic level, how he goes about defending the authority of the Vedas, that maybe we can talk some more about next time. But yeah, those are. Thank you for the slides as always.
No problem. And as always, it's great to participate in this study group, learn about philosophical traditions, some of which we were entirely ignorant of before. And yeah, it's always a great opportunity. And thanks you guys for the discussions.
Agree 100%. Those are great slides. I look forward to going over them in detail next time when we have our ritual session, and we can talk about rituals. I'm going to tag out and exit here, so I'll talk to you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jessica. I think we're going to sign off as well, so I'll play us off with the music. And thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.
Bye.